Die Tagesordnung.
So, the agenda. The first item this morning is the conclusions of the European Council meeting of the 20th and 21st of October. The first speaker is the President of the Council, Mr. Tusk.
Danke, Herr Präsident. Dear President, members of the European Parliament, the European Council last week had three main topics: migration, trade and Russia, including Russia's role in Syria. On migration, for the first time for more than a year, the European Council was not a crisis meeting. The flows to the Greek islands are down by 98% compared to this time last year. However, irregular flows on the central Mediterranean route, that is from Africa to Italy, remain far too high and actually have not changed for the last 2 years. That is why we focus most of our discussion on the cooperation with Africa. Leaders heard the first assessment from the High Representative on efforts to control the flows in the central Mediterranean in partnership with key countries. Good groundwork has been laid with Senegal, Mali, Niger, Nigeria and Ethiopia on the so-called Migration Compact. Leaders will assess first results in December in terms of our goal, which is to prevent illegal migration to Italy and to the rest of Europe and to ensure effective returns of irregular migrants. Leaders also discussed getting back to Schengen. The goal continues to be lifting temporary border controls over time. However, it has to be accompanied by further reinforcement of the external borders. The Commission will continue assessing the situation and come forward with its recommendations on this basis. The question of a reform of the common European asylum system was also discussed, including on how to apply the principles of solidarity and responsibility in the future. We agreed to consider concrete proposals by the Slovak presidency on this sensitive issue in December. We also had a discussion about Russia. Leaders shared individual experiences of several countries, ranging from disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks, interference in political processes in the EU and elsewhere, to airspace violations and the fanning of community conflicts in Ukraine, the Balkans, and further afield. Also, the developments in the MH17 investigation raised troubling questions. Overall, we had a sober assessment of this reality and no illusions. Increasing tensions with Russia is not our aim. We are simply reacting to steps taken by Russia, who is working with considerable energy and focus to weaken and divide the EU. Our long-term objective remains to find a modus vivendi. This means sticking to our values and interests, but also keeping the door open to dialogue. We all agreed that European unity in approaching Russia is our greatest strength, and so we will stand united. We also discussed Syria. We condemned the attacks by the Syrian regime and its allies, notably Russia, on civilians in Aleppo. The EU is calling for an end to the atrocities and an immediate cessation of hostilities. We asked the High Representative to pursue further diplomatic and humanitarian efforts. If these atrocities continue, all available options will be considered. The Syrian people need an immediate and permanent ceasefire and the reopening of humanitarian aid corridors. The last issue we discussed was trade. Our citizens are increasingly concerned about whether the trade deals we negotiate are in their best interest. And I am afraid that we won't be able to continue to negotiate free trade agreements if we do not prove that we are very serious about protecting European consumers, workers and companies. And when we discussed it, we drew a big red line between protection and protectionism. In this spirit, leaders committed to reaching an urgent agreement on the modernization of all the EU's trade defense instruments. I know that this Parliament is ready to support this. We have now tasked our trade ministers with breaking the deadlock. When it comes to CETA, the EU is still not ready to sign the agreement with Canada. But talks continue in Belgium also this morning. I thank all those who have helped facilitate these talks, especially Martin Schulz and Jean-Claude Juncker. You have showed a genuine leadership and responsibility. Thank you very much for your help. But at the end of the day, only the Belgians can decide on Belgium's position. I am impressed by the determination and engagement they have shown during the last hours. I still hope that Belgium will prove that it is a consensus-building champion and that we will be able to finalize this agreement soon. Here I must also express my gratitude to the Canadian and the Canadian side for their cooperation and perseverance. If we cannot make the case for free trade with a country like Canada, the most European country outside Europe and a close friend and ally, there are obvious consequences for Europe's global position. But it is too early to go there yet. As we speak, the summit tomorrow is still possible. On the Ukraine Association Agreement and DCFTA, the Dutch Prime Minister informed the European Council about the difficulties in ratifying the agreement. Prime Minister Rutte promised to use the next few days to try to work out a solution with the Dutch Parliament to address these difficulties. Whatever the outcome of the debate in the Netherlands is going to be, it is clear that we need to find a way ahead that is also agreeable to the other 27 member states and to Ukraine. Let me also report that we were glad to welcome Prime Minister May at the European Council. She confirmed that the United Kingdom will invoke Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty before the end of March next year. Consistent with our policy of no negotiations without notification, we did not discuss Brexit. However, given Prime Minister May's confirmation that Article 50 will be triggered, let me recall the EU 27 position of the 29th of June. We want as close relations as possible with the UK. There must be a balance between rights and obligations. And the UK can continue enjoying access to the single market, but it requires accepting all four freedoms. To conclude, let me recall the meeting of the 27 EU leaders that was held in September in Bratislava. We met informally to discuss the future of Europe in light of the UK referendum on Brexit. As also reflected in the Bratislava roadmap, the summit set out a number of actions to address the main concerns of Europeans: migration, security, both internal and external, and economic anxieties. It is now for Member States and the EU institutions to implement the roadmap, and as a matter of fact, we already started to do so. On the 5th of October, the EU ratified the Paris Agreement on climate change. The next day, the European Border and Coast Guard was launched in record time. Here I want to thank the European Parliament for its excellent and swift cooperation. And last week, the Bulgarian Prime Minister, Borisov, thanked his colleagues for the support to help protect the borders with Turkey, as decided in Bratislava. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Herr Ratspräsident. Das Wort hat jetzt.
Thank you, President. The next speaker is President Juncker, President of the European Commission.
Good morning, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, honourable members. The European Council on Thursday and Friday last in Brussels gave the impression to the outside world that we only discussed the free trade agreement with Canada. That was not the case. There were other items for discussion, and there was progress, notably in the field of migration. There is still a long way to go, and there are many pitfalls on the way. To strengthen our shared border, we have created in record time a European Border and Coast Guard, which is now in place and which now needs to be equipped with the staff and equipment it needs to be able to respond with the necessary speed. December is the date by which all of the planned systems have to be in place. I trust that the co-legislators will adopt an entry-exit system for the European Union by the end of the year in order to contain illegal migration. Fighting illegal migration, breaking up smuggling chains, and allowing legal migration to Europe requires us to work with Turkey. And in the 6 months since the adoption of the EU-Turkey declaration, the number of migrants in the 6 months since the signing of the agreement, we have a reduction of 721,000 migrants crossing the border from Turkey into Greece. In 6 months in 2015, there were over 500,000 there were 582 deaths of migrants crossing between Turkey and Greece. In the same period this year, it was 48. It is still 48 too many. We have to consolidate the fragile results achieved. That means continuing to help Greece. That means providing the officials necessary for the agencies working on the ground, and we need to help unaccompanied minors. We need to continue relocating migrants from Greece and continue the process of resettlement from Turkey to Europe. As President Tusk said, we are continuing to work with our African partners. We are working to agree compacts with countries like Niger, Nigeria, Mali, and Ethiopia. There is progress being made, but again, this is a new form of cooperation which needs to be consolidated, extended to other countries, and the external investment plan must kick in. We need to invest, and we need to do so quickly. We also need to reform the European asylum regime, including the Dublin mechanism. The Commission has proposed a genuinely European mechanism based on solidarity. In German, Mr. President, I'd like to say a few words about CETA. I trust that an agreement will be reached in the course of today between the governments of Belgium, Wallonia, and other parts of the country. I do not know if we will be able to sign the agreement with Canada tomorrow. In fact, signing tomorrow is not the point. What is the point is for agreement to be reached today so that the Kingdom of Belgium can sign the agreement at the appropriate moment. CETA is an important trade agreement. All trade agreements are important. We Europeans should not only insist on free trade, we should insist on fair trade. We are in favor of free trade, but not free trade being brought about at any price. The European Union needs to improve its trade defense instruments toolbox. High quality trade defense instruments are vital. In the preparations for the European Council, I had a look at the figures, what the USA are doing and what the European Union is doing. And I see that nobody is criticizing the USA. The Americans imposed 265% in anti-dumping duties on certain Chinese steel products. The equivalent trade defense measure in the European Union is 20%. And that is not the way to fight overproduction in China. Overproduction in China is double the level of production in the European Union, and hence we should not allow our hands to continue to be tied. The Americans defend their industry, defend their steel industry, and we should do the same.
Im Rat.
That's not the view of everyone in Council. The member states fall into two categories. 13-12 is the usual dividing line, and I insist that we improve the quality of our trade defense instruments. The future of our industry, not just the steel industry, depends on that, and I'll continue to campaign for it. We need a qualified majority for that. Our relationship with our partners in the world would be easier if we made more of an effort to make Europe's economy more competitive. Many things would be easier if we were more competitive. And we really do need to tackle this issue.
Describe the results of the European investment plan, but you have seen all the figures. Till now we have mobilized 138 billion of new instruments across 27 member states, and almost 300,000 small firms will have new loans. We are pursuing the aim to reach 315 billion from now to the year after next year. We have proposed as a Commission to double the financial amount of the investments, and we have proposed to the Council to double the duration of the plan. The European Council will come back to this issue in December, and I really do hope that on the basis of all the external and internal assessments that will be provided, that the European Council will take a decision along the lines of the proposal of the Commission. Herr Präsident, ich würde gerne ein letztes Wort.
And now, finally, Mr. President, a word about the difficulties there are in terms of the Dutch ratification of the agreement with Ukraine. I'd like to take this opportunity to appeal to the politicians of the Netherlands to understand the magnitude of this problem. It would be useful to achieve internal domestic political agreement in the Netherlands on this issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, President of the Commission. I'd like now to open the debate. The first speaker on behalf of the EPP is Mr. Weber.
President, colleagues, I had a look in the European Treaty to see what the task of the European Council is. The task of the Council is to decide on the strategic direction of the European Union, to give some orientation for the continent. If I look at the headlines of the last few days, I must say that doesn't seem to fit, because the Council seems to be creating more confusion than orientation, and that's rather disappointing. Let me go through the different topics. First of all, trade policy. Well, what are the challenges? We've got millions of people out of work, particularly young people on this continent out of work. We want to create jobs, and if we want to do that, we have to create growth. We won't get growth, given our demographic developments, without more trade. The US has completed an Asian trade agreement. Other countries are taking our place. That is the challenge we face. What is the answer? Well, we have basically ended up with the Canadian negotiators throwing in the towel, threatening to travel away. Well, why have we ended up in this situation? That's something that we're also responsible for in the European Parliament. In the last European Council meeting in July, the majority said that we need a mixed agreement and not anything else. What are we going to learn for the future? This is all very disappointing. Topics on Europe have to be answered in the European Parliament and nowhere else. What else have we learned? We've learned that we have to stand up and defend CETA. I want to appeal to the socialists. When I see the Austrian Chancellor's efforts to respond to the Canadians, then I think that we need to work together and try and resolve these problems. And I would like to expressly support the Commission's attempts to get more trade defence and better fair trade as well as free trade. And then on Russia, we clearly have challenges there too. They consider war as a legitimate means of pursuing political goals. There are hundreds dying every day in Aleppo. The Council was supposed to answer this, but this has been a very weak response. We have been discounting the possibility of using instruments that we should use, or should at least not eliminate from the outset. We have instruments. There are elements of our gas provision and other aspects that we could use. It seems that that's the only language that Putin understands. That's the language of strength. So I would like to see more strength from the European Council.
Was probably the statement from Theresa May. Why? Because she shows now to the European public what it means to leave the European Union. People see all over Europe how big the economic damage in Great Britain is already. The people see that Scotland is thinking about leaving Great Britain. The Scottish Prime Minister is rethinking a new referendum. Is rethinking a new referendum in Great Britain, and we have in the leading party, in the Tory party, an ongoing battle between Hammond and Johnson where nobody knows the outcome. So the country is split, and Theresa May shows to the whole European Union that it's better to reform the European Union and not to destroy the European Union. And people more and more recognize what populism means, ladies and gentlemen, because even here in the European Parliament we saw in the last Strasbourg week what populism means. UKIP showed us the true face. One UKIP member punching another UKIP member to hospital. And dear ladies and gentlemen, Herr Weber, ladies and gentlemen,
President, Mr. Weber.
Augenblick, Herr Weber. Wenn Sie jetzt mal einen Moment.
If you just let Mr. Weber finish, and if you listen to what he has to say, then I'll give the opportunity to make a point of order afterwards.
Unsere Geschäftsordnung sieht nicht.
The rules are quite clear. The rules do not provide for you having the right to shout down speakers. In this House we have rules. If you want to call a member of this House a disgrace, I suggest you start by looking carefully at your own behaviour here, sir.
Bitte, Weber, fahren Sie fort.
Mr. Weber, please continue.
I simply want to say that Nigel Farage is not anymore the winner of the referendum. Nigel Farage is fleeing from responsibility, and parts of his troop are behaving as ruffians. That is reality in this House. Dear ladies and gentlemen, ich möchte abschließen.
I shall just conclude my remarks. CETA. Well, the Commission has put forward a very good result. We in the European Parliament will be able to get a majority behind CETA and implement it. But unfortunately, we've got the European Council in a state of confusion. Trade defence instruments are important for us to defend our citizens in a globalised world, and the Commission has put forward very good proposals. In the European Parliament, we're capable of getting support for these. It's the member states where we've got a problem, where we've got blockades and splits. And then on migration, we've got the similar situation. We've got Dimitrios Avramopoulos here. He's put good proposals on the table about how we can respond to the migration crisis for Europe. We in the European Parliament can get good majorities behind those proposals, but it's the Council that can't stop squabbling. It's not a question of a lack of Europe, it's a question of unity. Europe needs unity, decisiveness and leadership. That's what we would like to ask from you, Council. Thank you.
Herr Weber, der Herr Abgeordnete.
Mr. Weber, the honourable member wants to put a question to you. Mr. Farage, go ahead.
But whilst it's regrettable that two of our MEPs fronted up to each other, there is absolutely no evidence that anybody was punched at all, and I do want that put on the record. However, if you would like to come outside with me, we could have a civilised conversation over a cup of coffee. Thank you. It's irresistible.
Bitte, Herr Weber.
Herr Farage, ich bin...
Well, Mr. Farage, well, I've seen those pictures of your colleague lying on the floor. I don't know if you've seen those pictures. I saw them. I was shocked when I saw that. Those kind of actions in a democratic parliament, just as a result of internal party disputes. Well, I keep hearing more and more reports from Great Britain about EU citizens facing xenophobic comments and attacks. There's more distrust. This is all thanks to your policies. And that's why we're going to struggle to the last against the kind of policies that you stand for, sir.
So, Herr Etheridge, Sie haben sich zur
Mr. Etheridge, you've asked to speak on the rules.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to say this in a calm and measured sense. There's an investigation going on into the events that Mr. Weber has just made accusations about. Not only an internal UKIP one, but a parliamentary one, where one of your colleagues is investigating this, one of our colleagues. What he has said has prejudiced that investigation, is absolutely outrageous, and I suggest to you, sir, asking you as the guardian of the rules, please, could you do something about this? This is unacceptable.
Ich habe zu Beginn dieser Sitzung, Herr
Mr. Etheridge, I'm not sure if you were in the House at the beginning of the meeting, but I actually announced that following those events, I have referred the matter to the Code of Conduct, the Advisory Committee. The Advisory Committee examined the case very carefully and advised me to refer the matter to the Public Prosecutor. medical examinations carried out after Mr. Wolf's admission to hospital suggest that when he collapsed on the bridge in the house, that followed a blow to his head. That stems from medical report. I have taken note of Mr. Wolf's allegations, and there is a clear suspicion that he was subjected to an act of violence, which is why we referred the matter to the prosecutors. I have no doubts about Mr. Wolf's allegations personally. The next speaker is Mr. PITTELLA on behalf of the Socialist Group. Thank you, President. I would like to welcome the various different presidents and, of course, Ms. Ratti. The fact is, certain members of the European Council seem to have forgotten what Romano Prodi, our cycling president, once said. He said, if you want to ride a bike, you have to pedal. And if you don't pedal, you end up flat on your face. That's rather like Europe. If we want to continue moving forward, we have to pedal. And if the European Council forgets to pedal too slowly, the whole thing falls flat on its face. We've had a quite timely reminder of this after the most recent summit. When we talked about Syria, the European President reiterated its pressing calls for stepping up humanitarian aid. Nothing's been done. There were calls for sanctions as well. But we need some kind of instrument to bring these massacres to an end. Obviously, it's important that we commend the efforts made by certain countries in defending external borders. Those same countries are, of course, welcoming thousands and thousands and thousands of refugees. We also welcome the role of the European Customs and External Borders Force, which Mr. Juncker talked about. However, the silence of the Council on these matters is deafening. From Bratislava in December to Brussels, the Council continues to talk about extending the European investment plan. But what on earth is there to talk about? We want you to adopt it. We want you to extend the plan and to step up the European investment plan. And it's not enough just to talk about relocation. This double set of standards on the right is something which fails to convince me. They have plenty to say about our failure to adopt CETA, while remaining silent when it comes to forcing Orban to accept resettlement. We have to ensure that all those people who've been calling for some clarification on these issues, we have to remember that we're talking here about the most progressive trade agreement we've signed yet. In Wallonia, there is not an ideological condemnation of the CETA agreement. There is a quite justified request for clarification. Mr. Juncker, Mr. Schulz are aware of what the situation is, and they've both stressed that we have to continue working on this so as to enable us to move towards a good and balanced solution. As far as immigration is concerned, we have to bring an end to this I'm all right, Jack attitude. That's of no help to anybody if we're to help Europe find a common, joint solution to this enormous problem. I'd like to wind up by saying that the European Parliament can't be a place of fisticuffs. We have to speak out loud, but in a united way. We have to denounce what's happening in Aleppo. We have to speak loud to call for equitable trade agreements, to denounce the industrial crisis. We have to cry out for a more growth-orientated industrial policy for equality of men and women. We have to shout out for dignity for the people of Europe and our institutions. We have to have the courage to stand up. We have to try to put a smile back on the face of our children, those children who hope for a better future. That's the European Parliament we should believe in and that we should all be trying to build.
For the
ECR group, we'll hear from Mr. Kamall.
Thank you. If ever there was a theme for a summit meeting, then surely the theme of this one was gridlock. Powerless to move or commit to decisions on some of the key issues facing the West and the EU right now. At a time when voters in all EU countries are asking questions of their political leaders, the EU has been defined in the past week by weakness and indecision. We should ask ourselves, why is it so difficult to unite on these key issues? Why does a trade agreement like CETA fail at the last hurdle? The ECR group is asking, if the EU cannot even reach an agreement with a country such as Canada, a country with similar environmental and labour standards, what hope do we have for telling the rest of the world that the EU is open for business? And why could the 28 leaders not make progress? Because there is a fundamental disconnect between EU leaders and the people they represent. With greater centralisation, individuals and communities feel weaker. Here, we use the language of compromise, coalitions and semesters. But people outside want to know, will they have more money in their pay packet? Will they be able to pay their bills? Will the business they work for grow and create jobs? And all too often, these simple questions go unanswered. If leaders fail to address these concerns, if leaders fail to listen to the warnings, if leaders fail to make the case for the decisions taken, then don't be surprised if voters in many of our countries turn to extremist parties offering simplistic solutions. I realise that our countries have different histories and perhaps different interests when dealing with Russia. But responding to Russia's current actions is something which should unite us rather than divide us. But when we see continued violations by Russia in Ukraine and Georgia, when we see the bombing of Aleppo and its people, when we see Russia biting at the heels of the EU's external border, the whole West should be uniting together in wanting to use what power we have. The EU only has soft power, but surely soft power should be better than no power. Economic sanctions are beginning to have an effect on Russia, but not nearly enough. Yet even at this point, leaders could not agree to go further. And now we see one EU country, Spain, offering to refuel that same Russian fleet that is likely to inflict more atrocities on the civilians of Aleppo. What kind of signal does that send about our resolve? At this rate, we are facing a future of the lowest common denominator politics. We needed a summit of action. We needed a summit of clarity. We needed a summit of decisiveness. And yet again, this is not what we got. It is time to open our eyes and see what is happening around us. Just as each action has its consequences, inaction also has consequences. Prime Minister Trudeau walking away from a Canada-EU trade deal which would have helped to create jobs and growth. Putin walking into other countries unchecked and uninhibited. If this is the result of our inaction, don't be surprised if our electorates eventually punish us. To counter the simple message of extremism, to regain the confidence of the people who vote for us, we need solutions, we need action, and we need a new direction to break the gridlock that we currently face.
Herr Kamall, es gibt eine Frage.
Mr. Kamall, Ms. JAAKONSAARI has a question for you. Would you mind answering?
Bitte sehr, Frau JAAKONSAARI.
Go ahead, Ms. JAAKONSAARI. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. Kamall, you are a great orator, but you give us very few answers. You say there's been a weak reaction to Russia. Should Council have imposed sanctions? What should it have done? It condemned very robustly the bombing of Aleppo. Please give us some answers.
Well, thank you very much for the compliment. I'll take any compliment I get in this place. But actually, it was quite clear. I think the answer was in your question. You asked, should the Council impose sanctions? The answer is a clear yes. Sanctions haven't begun to bite properly yet. They are starting to work, and actually we should not let up. We should have imposed more sanctions, and we should be looking at whatever instruments we have. Other speakers have said that this morning, and actually we know we are not alone. If we are to show true unity in the West, we have to use what instruments we have, and we can use sanctions. Thank you.
Das Wort hat jetzt für die Fraktion.
And now on behalf of the Liberals and Democrats, Ms. Intveld.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Mr. Tusk, Mr. Juncker, there seems to be a recurring theme in all the interventions, and that is the, by now, total inability of the Council to take any kind of decision. But I'll come back to that. First, on CETA. The ALDE Group wants CETA to be salvaged, and if more time is needed, then more time is needed. It's not the date, but the result that matters. However, we cannot unpick the work that has been done, because trade is essential for our prosperity. And the credibility of the European Union, it has been said by others, has been severely damaged. And the winners of this episode are not the Walloon farmers or the Walloon entrepreneurs. The winners are China and Russia and other countries, because they will get to set the standards and not Europe. Now, some parties in this House are actually welcoming the veto by Wallonia because they are against CETA. But that is a very dangerous kind of opportunism. Welcoming a veto when it suits your purpose will boomerang, because tomorrow a veto will be used against your priorities. But the CETA episode exposes a much bigger problem, as I said, the weakness of the Council. Now, colleagues, Mr. Tusk, the EU cannot continue like this. If we look at the list of topics on the table, sanctions against Russia blocked, the Ukraine agreement jeopardized, CETA blocked, refugee relocation blown out of the water, decision on Article 50, the EU has been kept dangling for 9 months, and now one of the countries is threatening to veto the budget. We cannot continue like this. The EU is like a 3-engine plane with one engine completely broken down. Now, it's still flying as the other 2 engines are still working, but it cannot stay on course until the Council engine is fixed. Mr. Tusk, please ensure that the European Union will not undergo the same fate as Poland in the 18th century, as the Polish Parliament was completely paralysed by the so-called liberum veto, allowing every single nobleman in the parliament to block a decision. And as a result, Poland did not become greater, but it became irrelevant. And the Council has to take responsibility for the European Union as a whole, and it has to do so soon. Because not only will our own citizens tire of the inability of the EU to respond to the big challenges of today, but Europe is rapidly making itself irrelevant as a global actor. And that has an impact. It has already been mentioned. The victims of the same inability to take decisions are the people in Syria. If the EU fails to decide on sanctions against Mr. Putin, we lose any leverage we may have to force him to stop the bombing. We need a political transition urgently, and that means that we have to be able to put pressure on Mr. Putin. But victims are equally the refugees. And I'm actually a bit surprised to hear the Council, but also the Commission, to be quite jubilant about the successful refugee policies, when the United Nations just yesterday said that 2016 is the deadliest year so far. More people have drowned in the Mediterranean than any year before. How can you say this is a success? Exactly. How is it that the Council can still look itself in the mirror and say this is a success? So, Mr. Tusk, the Council, the member state leaders have a duty to end the paralysis, a duty towards the EU citizens and a duty towards the world. Thank you.
Für die Vereinigte Linke.
For the United Left now, we'll hear from Mr. Sylikiotis.
Thank you, Chair. As the GUE group, we believe, and our conviction is, for peace and against all wars. It is right to condemn the attacks and bombings of the Syrian regime and Russia in East Aleppo. But there are no good and bad bombs. The same barbaric and destructive are the bombs that the jihadis and the rebels throw on West Aleppo, which close the humanitarian corridors, and the US bombs that kill civilians in Syria and Iraq are as bad. So we shouldn't ignore what our allies do. The Saudis kill civilians and children in Yemen. And in the same way, you showed tolerance to the Israeli bombings that destroyed hospitals in the Gaza Strip. And the US and NATO tried to change the borders in the Middle East through violence. And it's also the European Council's responsibility that we are being hypocritical in implementing the unacceptable agreement that we've had with Turkey, which is against international law and creates the conditions for the trafficking of refugees. Instead of criticizing the Turkish government, which is becoming more and more authoritarian, and it tramples the rights and liberties of the Turkish people, it invades Syria, and it is perpetrating genocide against the Kurds, and fighting the minorities, and persecuting journalists. We reward them, we recognize it as a safe country to try to avoid the refugees reaching our borders. You would like also to liberalize the visa regime without Turkey having fulfilled its obligations towards all states. These are double standards. This is the result of your policies, which have made the refugee crisis even worse. Unfortunately, the Commission and Council insist that there should be more border guards, more Frontex, more controls in our borders, more of a fortress for Europe. It's your responsibility that you closed the Balkan corridor. This means that now refugees drown near the Libyan coast and near Lampedusa and not in the Aegean. We will not face the humanitarian crisis in this way. We only increase xenophobia and racism. What we need is a refugee policy based on solidarity and humanity. We need legal and safe routes for refugees. We need a fair and binding relocalization system. We should stop the wars in the Middle East. We should help the countries in Africa. Now, concerning CETA, the people said no to CETA. With their struggles, they marginalized TTIP as well. And what is clear those last days is that the Council and the Commission try through CETA to bring back TTIP by the back door. As GUE, we welcome the courageous stand of Wallonia, who are against the ultimatums, because they've salvaged the decency of the European Union. They've expressed the true will of millions of EU citizens. Thank you.
Mr. Voigt has a blue card question for you, Mr. Sylikiotis. Will you accept it?
Sind Sie damit einverstanden?
Will you accept the question?
Bitte sehr.
Go ahead.
Ja, danke, Herr Präsident.
Yes, thank you very much, President. Thank you. If I've understood correctly, the United European Left is against all forms of violence in the Syrian war. Well, why in that case do you not condemn the destruction of the 7 bridges by the US Air Force, which was never permitted?
Bitte sehr.
I think that I was clear. I don't know if you've listened to everything I said. I spoke about US bombings as well. There aren't any good or bad bombs. All bombs kill civilians and children. We shouldn't just one-sidedly condemn only the bombings in East Aleppo. We should condemn the jihadi actions, the actions of the rebels, who are the allies of the Union, as well as the US bombings.
Grüne Fraktion, Herr Vorsitzender Lamberts.
And now for the Green Group, Mr. Lambert.
Thank you very much, President. Well, indignation, contestation, rejection, well, that is what too many of our citizens feel about Europe now. Many people
in this room are happy to see that as a sign of a return to national identities. But no, I don't think that's correct. It's rather an alarm, a cry of alarm, to say, as politicians seem to be moving further away from reality. And here we see the situation of Wallonia, one of the most inclusive regions of the Europe, and pro-European regions. They have rejected the CETA treaty, and that's no accident. For many years in Wallonia, it's been the #1 subject that has got our citizens motivated. The French-speaking citizens in Wallonia have looked at the details of CETA in a way that no one has in Europe. They have examined it very carefully. They have serious reservations about this idea that companies and their shareholders should have power over our democracies. Rather than just being a killjoy, Wallonia is representing all of our citizens who reject a trade policy that simply serves the multinationals. People are trying to suggest that Wallonia is isolated, but it's quite the contrary. 500 local authorities in Europe have declared themselves outside TTIP and CETA. And there is a wide rejection of the investor dispute settlement systems, including the Austrians and many other countries. First of all, it seems that there's kind of denial when it came to the letter sent by the President of Wallonia expressing the concerns of its parliament. Then they said, basically, if you haven't agreed with us, it's because you haven't understood, and they tried to convince us. But then they moved on to intimidation, Mr. Tusk. And then a whole patchwork of declarations of doubtful legitimacy and increasing the sense of confusion. Wallonia's efforts to try and unblock CETA as contrasts rather with the attitudes of others. There are concerns about tax evasion and financial regulation. But I think the most flagrant decision made by the European Council last week was that there was the extremists for free trade and extremists again on migration, just asking for refoulement. But services and finances can circulate freely, but not human beings. That seems to be the message that comes out of the Council. I'll cite your words. Europe's citizens want to know if Europe's elites are capable of taking back control of events and that go beyond them and occasionally terrify them. A few days later, in your State of the Union address, Mr. Juncker, you said you wanted a Europe that protects our European way of life and a Europe that gives power to our citizens. Well, sir, let's measure your words by your acts. Here, the French-speaking Belgians are giving an opportunity to the Commission and Council to try and remove the kangaroo courts that are removing the rights from our citizens. There needs to be a clear decision about which services are public and which are to be private. Now, I think it's very important also to refer any conflicts between this treaty and European law to the Court of Justice. Will this take time? Yes, it will take time, but democracy takes time. We have traded with Canada for centuries without CETA, so I don't think a few extra months will be so decisive. The rejection from Wallonia should not put an end to Europe's trade policy, but rather it should give us a chance to re-examine the way that we deal with it. Our citizens are not opposed to trade to core. Rather, we need to ensure that it's not just a question of maximizing flows, because that's not necessarily compatible with the environment. It's not simply a question of maximizing profit. Rather, the objective should be to protect our tax standards, our environmental standards, our social standards at the highest possible level. These are the standards that have to form the framework within which free trade can develop. Trade policy can never be decided upon in secret. Quite to the contrary.
We need full transparency and full scrutiny by our citizens of trade agreements. That's the only way in which Europe's trade policy will regain the trust of our citizens. A no to CETA is a yes to a Europe of the citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lambert. There's now a flood of blue cards in response to your speech. You want to choose who puts a question? Well, it was Ms. VAUTMANS who was the first. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you. Mr. Lamberts, what you seem to be trying to say is that you're not alone in your resistance through CETA. However, I would like to remind you that 27 other countries did give their agreements. They said, yes, we want to trade with Canada, even if CETA is necessary. But I would like to invite you to Hasberger, one of our neighbours, and they're very much in favour of CETA, because trade barriers will disappear. Perhaps you don't need that in Wallonia, but we in Flanders want to open up trade, following on from the good example set by Commissioner de Gucht a few years ago. Mr. Lamberts, you seem to be suggesting that this no was a call to Europe. In that case, I would call on you to recognise the fact that it might actually have been a historical mistake by the Commission to go for this approach in ratifying the treaty.
Well, that was quite a few questions. I'll focus on the first one. Why is Wallonia the only institution to say no? Well, 27 other member states, including plus Flanders, say yes. But my answer to you is very simple. In Europe, there are two parliaments. The Wallonian Parliament and the French-speaking Parliament in Belgium have properly discussed CETA. The others simply did not do it. I'm thinking of the French National Assembly in the first line. So that is basically governments going over the heads of what their citizens want.
Ja. Mal schauen.
Well, we'll see. Mr. Lamberts.
Leute,
people.
Könnt ihr euch denn jetzt mal beruhigen?
A little calm in the chamber, please. Colleagues.
Kollegen, kommt doch mal zu.
Order, please. We'll have to see what the national parliaments that did deal with CETA have to say about what you've just said. And now we're going to hear from Mr. Farage for the EFDD group.
So Mrs. Smith goes to Brussels and you give her 5 minutes to speak at 1 o'clock in the morning. It's about the same treatment that David Cameron got when he came to announce the referendum. At least this time the French president didn't leave the table to go to the bathroom. And when Mr. Juncker was asked by a British journalist how the negotiations were going, he said, poof, or I can't really do Gallic shrugs very well, but the impression is that you're simply too busy to even discuss Brexit or to take it seriously. Basically, you're hoping that we'll change our minds. Mr. Tusk alluded to that a couple of months ago. And I know there's been a long tradition here, whether it's with Denmark or France or Ireland or the Netherlands, that when there's a democratic referendum, you try to either ignore it or overturn it. And again today we heard Mr. Juncker urging the Dutch government to ignore the referendum result on the Ukraine. Frankly, the whole thing's a disgrace. And it's even worse that it's supported by quislings in the British Parliament, people like Nick Clegg and Ed Miliband, who were desperate to keep Britain inside this awful single market. Well, I'm sorry, but it simply isn't going to happen. There are 17.4 million people who could not have been clearer. We voted to say we want our country back, and in the end, that is what is going to happen. I have to confess, though, that Mrs. May's position in her 5 minutes was somewhat curious. For her to be arguing that Britain must have a full vote and a full say in all EU affairs up until the time we leave is a very mixed message. And I've seen already this morning that some here take it as a sign of weakness. We need to get on with it. Every single day that goes by is a lost opportunity. And you only have to see that after 7 years of negotiation, the proposed trade agreement with Canada having been vetoed by the Walloons, absolutely proves to you that in a modern 21st century global economy that the European Union simply isn't fit for purpose. And I want us to get on with it because this club's very expensive. We're paying in net £30 million every day. Now, some will argue it's a bit less, some will argue it's a bit more. Either way, it is too much. We're helping to finance this monthly travelling circus to Strasbourg, and worst of all, I've now discovered that up to 5% on your staff regulations, up to 5% of employees every year are allowed to retire 5 years early and receive full pay and entitlements for 5 years for doing absolutely nothing. I mean, nowhere else in the world would allow this sort of thing to go on. So I want us to get on with it. And interestingly, I met a large number of Scandinavian businesses the other day, and they're worried. They're anxious. And why? Because they know that the United Kingdom is the Eurozone's biggest export market in the world. And they want to crack on. They know that the EU has trade deals with several countries in the world that involves no free movement of people. And their logic is, if we can do a deal like that with Mexico, why on earth wouldn't we do it with our most important trading global partner? And that actually is common sense coming from European businesses, common sense, I think, coming from most people in the United Kingdom. The only obstacle appears to be the high priests of Eurofederalism in this room today. If you think by delaying Brexit, if you think by stopping Brexit, you are going to help your own businesses, your own industries, you're wrong. It's in the mutual interest of all of us to get on with this and conclude a sensible, straightforward, tariff-free deal.
Mr. Farage, may I ask you something? Did you refer to Messrs. Clegg and Miliband as quislings?
Certainly did, yes.
I should just like to point out that Mr. Quisling was the leader of the Nazi collaborators in Norway. I think it is inappropriate to compare democratically elected politicians with such an individual.
Nehmen Sie das Mikrofon. Nehmen Sie das
His own
Mikrofon.
country.
Okay.
Oh, I'm not allowed to answer. Oh, fine. Oh, well, there we are. Isn't it lovely? He did it against the interest and the will of his own people, and the point I'm making about Messrs. Clegg and Miliband is they are refusing to accept a democratic result, just as Mr. Juncker is refusing to accept the Dutch referendum. There is something fundamentally wrong here.
Zumindest haben diese Männer ihr...
At least those gentlemen did not feed their electorate with false figures, as you did.
Das Wort hat jetzt...
I now give the floor...
Das Wort hat jetzt...
I now give the floor to Madame Le Pen for the ENF group.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I hope you were using your fourth blue cards later in the debate. So, you started out with a principle which you seem to be using your very own way, which is democracy. After British Brexit, we find the Wallonian Assembly actually doing its job, and that seems quite surprising to you. Its job is, of course, to defend Walloons. Amazing. So this treaty, which you've secretly been negotiating with Canada, and which was supposed to come into force before actually being ratified, which I'm sure you'd agree is absolutely scandalous. So they think this treaty is not in the interest of people. I'm sure that a few extremely rich multinationals are delighted with the treaty, but the vast majority of our people aren't. A university in the United States has actually evaluated its consequences. The loss of 45,000 jobs in France, 200,000 in Europe, a drop in wages, reduction of public policy making, a drop in growth, increase in public deficits. Don't tell us that the Walloons are blocking the rest of Europe. That's simply wrong. The fact is, the Walloons are the only people in Europe who actually had the chance to vote. People seem to be suggesting now that they weren't properly informed. Or perhaps they've simply started opening their eyes to the disaster which European liberal policies have led to. Somebody said this morning Europe's about peace. However, in your impotent rage, you're now threatening to use force. You're denouncing Mr. Magnet and his ultimatums, his authoritarian manoeuvring. No, I'm very sorry. A sovereign parliament spoke out. Either you accept it or you resign. Any other choice would simply be an effort to kill and stifle democracy. I'm sure Mr. Schulz will forgive me exceeding my speaking time by a few moments if I come back to what you said beforehand about protectionism, a concept which the European institutions are unanimous in denouncing. Perhaps I could tell you that this is a spectacular ideological victory which, as you know all too well, always precedes political victories.
Madame Le Pen, Mr. Coburn has a question for you.
Coburn.
Go ahead, Mr. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madame Le Pen. I thought I didn't need one of these, but thank you very much anyway. Thank you, Mr. President. Madame Le Pen, with the Wallonians halting the trade treaty with Canada, would you not agree with me that the British are better off leaving the European Union, where we don't have to have 27 other people agreeing, 27 other people and Wallonia agreeing to any future trade treaties? Wouldn't France be better off joining Britain in a Frexit so that France can have the same privileges to make her own trade treaties with the world and get France out of the catastrophic economic mess that Monsieur Hollande has put in? Thank you, Madame.
Monsieur Coburn, je crois en réalité.
Mr. Coburn, the fact is, I believe the overwhelming majority of the peoples of Europe agree with you. Only their elites believe the contrary. They betray them on a daily basis, and they try to continue a system which is collapsing. This is why I'm in favour of referendum, not only for my own country, but also, I'm a generous person by nature. I feel that all people in Europe should have the opportunity to speak out on this matter.
I now give the floor to Mr. Papadakis of the non-attached.
Mr. Schulz, despite your anti-communist sayings this morning about Hungary, you cannot rewrite history. What's the result of overthrowing socialism? Exploitation and wars and poverty. Capitalism, that is. That is why the peoples pay for the intense rivalries of the monopolies, which are reflected also in your summits. That's why there are new flames of war in Mosul for oil, which creates more flows of refugees. With your common decision, it is urgent to fight against imperialist war and to face the overcrowding of the hotspots on the Greek islands. And we should transfer the refugees and migrants to their final destination. Concerning the blocking by Wallonia of CETA, that's about who'll have the upper hand on imposing norms that serves their profit against their competitors. It is just the sharing out of the booty for more measures against the working people, for more rights to the monopolies, for destroying the rights of working people to work, health, education and protection of the environment. That's why the government of Syriza and Anel in Greece are for. But the peoples are against trying to get a so-called better and more transparent. They're against CETA, against TTIP. They want to overthrow their real opponent, the monopolies, their unions, and the exploitative system on which they are based.
There is a blue card request from Mr. Etheridge. Will you accept, please? A blue card request? Yes? Yes. Mr. Etheridge, 30 seconds.
Thank you. In the light of the debate that we've seen this morning, where we've had the whole of European trade seemingly held up by one area, and where we've had the President of the European Union showing, in my view, absolutely unacceptable bias against one side, would you agree with me that now, in this madness that we've seen, the Walloons probably have taken over the asylum?
The floor is yours.
What we're saying is that there is an intense war between major interests for controlling markets, and there are also geopolitical interests involved, and the peoples have different interests. They are against all such agreements, so we must organize our struggle without delay to overcome these rivalries. They should organize their struggle against any such agreement which is against the interests of the peoples. They should fight to get power.
Minute 30 seconds. Herr Reul.
Ja, ich hab's an. Klappt's?
It's on. Is it working? Madam President, gentlemen presidents, Europe is in jeopardy. Everybody has said so, and it is so because none of us have demonstrated an ability to solve problems. That is quite clear, and it's quite clear that Council is in a logjam as a result of national selfishness. Many leaders in Council are swayed by populist voices. On things like Syria and Russia, we're not able to nail our colours to the mast. It's not enough for Europe to say this is bad, this is appalling. We need to take action, otherwise we are not credible, otherwise we cannot talk about solidarity. And CETA falls down on a small regional parliament. On migration, we're unable to do anything because of the inaction of certain member states. Our member states are not able to respect our own rules. We have to be able to implement what has been agreed on. We have to be able to do what we've agreed to do. Otherwise, we can close the whole thing down. I am irritated at the fact that member states say, no, we're not going to take refugees. Another member state says 1.8%, 2.3%, and nobody actually does anything. Europe is not going to be taken seriously at this rate. It's somewhat down to us. Yes, Council has its share of the blame, but us here, we're to blame too. We have to ensure that what has been agreed is done. We can't just whinge. Why is that light flashing? The President of the Commission has said we have to look after industry, protect our industry. We have to allow our industry to develop and become competitive. That's our responsibility.
Thank you. 2 minutes, Mr. Fleckenstein, bitte.
Frau Präsidentin.
Madam President, colleagues, President Tusk, you said, well, finally, this wasn't a crisis summit. But if I look at the cover note, where you write down the results, well, I'm not surprised. You talk about migration, you're talking about protection of external borders, preventing illegal migration, all very important things. But the really important one is the one that you have under AOB, and that's the relocation and resettlement, and how we deal with that. If you simply hadn't spoken about that, it would have been even more comfortable for you at your summit. Well, we do agree with the points that you did deal with, and it's necessary. But you need to have the right balance, because we have other problems out there. And to deal with issues at the end of the day with a footnote saying without prejudice to the positions of Hungary and Slovakia, it doesn't really help us very much. Well, it's important that we should be united in saying that what's happening in Aleppo is a crime of the Syrian government against its own population, and that this is supported by Russia, or at least actively as in actively promoted. So I mean, I think that that's not acceptable, and it's important that we should state that clearly. However, if the European Council concentrates entirely on humanitarian measures to bring the urgent help for Aleppo and the Syrian people, then I think that's important. The suffering of Syria's civilians must end. But it should be important for Russia too. It shouldn't only be for Russia. It should be important for all of the countries that are in conflict in Syria. Many people would like to have seen sanctions from the European Council against Russia. But I think that we help the Syrian civilian population if we follow Mrs. Mogherini's proposal and we really act much more actively, diplomatically to find a solution.
Mr. Czarnecki.
Madam President, gentlemen presidents, I have a speech ready here. I'm going to tear it up. I have to react to what's been said in the chamber. Poland, Ms. Infeld, didn't disappear from the map of Europe because it had a bad parliament. It was divided by three partitioning powers, Russia, Prussia and Austria. I'd be very happy to give you a history lesson. We've heard about the Juncker plan. We've heard a lot about the Juncker plan. I hope the Juncker plan will eventually be an opportunity for investment, for companies in the new part of the EU that joined in 2004, because it looks as though it's being reserved as something for the EU 15, and that's unacceptable. And to Mr. Weber, I would say, CETA, it's also a matter for the member states. Thank you.
1 minute, Mr. TELIČKA.
Tusk, I'm afraid I will have 2 or 3 critical remarks towards the European Council conclusions. If I look at trade, it says the EU is committed to a robust trade policy, etc. And then the first paras of substance are EU trade interests include fully defending, promoting the social, environmental, etc. In this context, the European Council believes that unfair trade practices. Now, don't get me wrong. I want an improved defence mechanisms, but I expected a certain leadership here, certain kind of courage, and say what the agreement, what CETA really means, why it should be signed at the outset and as soon as possible. I mean, what Mr. Lambert has said here today is not true. I mean, we had a mandate, and neither Wallonia nor Belgium has raised those issues of concern when the mandate has been approved. Secondly, it concerns Russia. If we look again at the European Council conclusions, what does it say? The EU is considering all available options should the current atrocities continue. I mean, you as a Pole, you know that the Russians will laugh at this text. Yeah, this is a reality. I mean, on the background of people dying, being killed, innocent people, humanitarian convoy is not able to reach. Final remark, I do apologize. On migration, if we look at the European Council conclusions, skip diplomacy, skip the diplomatic language, because if you look at it, measurable results, I don't see anything measurable here. Thank you.
Madam Minuro, 1 minute, please.
Voorzitter.
President, CETA is a blueprint for the way in which the European Union negotiates free trade agreements. I think it's better that we stop today rather than tomorrow. Is it part of that blueprint that the President of the European Parliament takes over negotiations without any mandate? Is it part of the blueprint that parliaments are given practically no time to talk about the provisions of the agreement? Is it part of the blueprint that we don't focus on essential matters such as the legal value of interpretation, the compliance with investment rules on European rules, and the way in which the burden is actually shared? Is it part of the blueprint that negotiations take place exclusively behind closed doors, with a grandstand seat for multinationals and citizens and NGOs outside? Is it part of the blueprint that democratic scrutiny over our legislation is handed over lock, stock and barrel to business? Is it part of our blueprint that we abandon our rules? As Mr Verhofstadt and others seem to be suggesting, that national parliaments simply be sidelined and replaced by businesses. If CETA is a blueprint for our future free trade agreements, I think all of us should be ashamed of describing ourselves as members of a democratic house. Stop CETA.
Mrs. Keller.
Dear colleagues, the situation that we have right now with CETA was completely foreseeable, was completely predictable. It was nothing that came out of the blue, because the concerns that were raised by the Wallonian government were also raised by millions of citizens who went to the streets, who signed petitions and all of that. It's nothing new. The problem was that those concerns were not addressed, or not sufficiently at all addressed. And I think we together need to learn the lessons. How do we go ahead now? What do we do with that? What do we learn from that? I think one big problem is that member states indeed didn't say that they have actually problems at home. The Belgian Prime Minister should have said that there's going to be issues. The German Minister for Trade, for example, should say that he has a court case still running on that. The Austrian Prime Minister should mention at least that his parliament has voted against ISDS. There are so many issues that the member states never bring up to the European problems area, which is causing problems. But also the trade agreements are putting too many issues right now. It's not any longer about trade, it's all about regulation. And when Mr Weber says that the European Parliament needs to be more involved, I'm all in favour of that. But then why did the Conservatives, together with the Social Democrats, stop a proper discussion here in the European Parliament? That I don't understand. Thank you.
There is a blue card from Mrs in 't Veld. Will you accept?
There's something that bugs me about many of the statements that have been made on this side of the House. You're all welcoming the veto by the Wallonian Parliament, and in doing so you actually disregard decisions that have been taken, democratic decisions in other countries. I mean, what kind of a democrat are you if you say that the Wallonian Parliament, which is indeed democratically elected, as Mrs Le Pen said, but so are the other parliaments? All the 28 member states have democratic institutional arrangements that you seem to completely deny.
Not quite. I don't really see the criticism, understand the criticism here, because I would never deny the democratic legitimacy of the other parliaments. But I think, no, I don't. And I think a big problem is that indeed many parliaments are only asked, including us, we're only asked when the whole deal is done. They should have been asked before, and then they could raise it. No, they were not. Not all of them offer. It was great if it was done differently in your parliament, but others were not. And the European Parliament, to stay with that, was not asked before. We can do resolutions which are completely disregarded, and if we're only asked afterwards, as well as national parliaments, it will end up in a mess.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm going to be really strict on time and discipline. We have a long vote at 12 o'clock, so I now give the floor, with that warning, to Madam Ferreira for 1 minute, please. Please, colleagues, could you take the conversation outside the chamber? Thank you. Madam Ferreira.
Thank you very much, President. President Juncker said today that we need to reform Dublin to have a real European asylum system, and that it should show solidarity. Well, I entirely agree with him. It's just a pity that the proposals for reform of Dublin that the Commission has presented relegates fairness and solidarity to exceptional cases. The Council should, well, it started talking about the idea of flexible solidarity, and I think we should prepare ourselves for the worst. We're talking about better cooperation with African countries, but we have to be coherent here. There's a danger, because if we don't see trade policies as being part of the problem causing our migration flows, then we will only solve part of the problem. But it's not only Africa that should lead us to have concerns about trade agreements. More and more European citizens are opposing trade agreements like CETA and TTIP. These treaties put private interests and profits of multinationals as a priority faced with democracy and the rights of citizens and states. So thank you very much.
1 minute, please.
President, the EU summit on the 20th and 31st of October did, as expected, fail to provide any concrete results. It was a complete fiasco. Let me repeat. Frontex is actually a human trafficker for Islamic services from the Middle East. We have to bring that to an end. It's also an open door for terrorists and weapons smugglers. The economic policies dictated from Brussels are spreading poverty in our population. That has to come to an end. Our group believes in the freedom of citizens. Throw out all these people trying to force their way into the European Union, close down mosques, close our borders. Our group calls on the Commission to try to restore the prosperity of our people, bring the Euro, TTIP and the CETA to an end, bring to an end liberalisation. Mr Juncker, Netherlands might try to ratify the UK treaty, but Mr Juncker should listen more carefully to the will of the people and stand down.
Synadinos.
Once more, the EU leaders during the summit meeting just went on making just statements with no meaning and just expressing wishes. We should stop illegal immigration. We don't need the European border guard and the we don't need these new instruments like the border guard and the visa regime. We just need to stop illegal immigration. If we want to stop illegal immigration through Eastern Europe, we should seal the borders between Greece and Bulgaria and more sanctions to Turkey because it does not respect basic rights and freedoms. Finally, on Syria, there is a dead end and no strategic plan. They condemned the Syrian regime and Russia on civilians, for attacking civilians. But why our leaders do not condemn the Islamic State? That's what I want to know. Thank you.
1.5 minutes, Mr Lewandowski. Colleagues, apologies, Mr Lewandowski. Could I ask the front row not to have a conversation in the chamber? Mr Lewandowski, you have the floor.
Dziękuję. Jeśli prawdą jest, że Unia...
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, if it's really true that the EU develops through crises, then we can only envy Mr Tusk and Mr Juncker steering Europe through such interesting times. But today we're talking about the credibility of the European institutions, and we have quite a number of concerns in this debate as to whether reason will prevail. Europe's citizens are insecure. They are concerned about a number of issues, including migration. And it seems that Europe's future really is at stake at this point in time. Happily, there are more and more people who understand that there are no good national solutions. Rather, there can only be European solutions. But the European Union has to maintain its position as a global player. But this is all overshadowed by the tragicomedy of CETA. We have ended up as the victims of the position of a single region in Europe. I hope that there will be a good solution to this problem. But the credibility of the European Union is weakened seriously. We really need to prove that we can be effective. We as the European institutions need to do so. I hope that the next summit will contribute to doing that.
It's Mr Bostinaro.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Monsieur le Président du Conseil, Monsieur le Président de la Commission européenne, distinguished colleagues, while we are talking here about the bombing in Aleppo, the bombing are only continuing every day. Russia and Assad have no regards towards the international humanitarian law, distinction and proportionality. They are refusing any ceasefire that will allow humanitarian relief. Last Friday in Geneva, and I'm convinced you are fully aware about that, the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, Zeid Ra'ad al-Hussein, described the bombardment and siege of Aleppo as, and I quote, crimes of historic proportions, and he referred to the lifeless bodies of small children which are trapped under streets of rubble. He called on the UN to speak one single voice What I ask to the Council is to do the same and tell that the collective failure of the international community to protect civilians and to halt this bloodshed should haunt every one of us. Yes, colleagues, I also believe it's unforgivable today to assist such a horror and to do so little, probably only speaking. Yes, no one could contest the complexity of the Syrian war, the past errors and the current ones, the many actors which are to be blamed. No one could contest our strong commitment in fighting Daesh and other UN Security Council recognized terrorist groups. But no one can contest either the deliberate bombing of civilians, hospitals and humanitarian professionals in Aleppo by Russia. And no, the fact that there are potential extremist groups infiltrated is not an excuse for any one of us. Fight against terrorism doesn't excuse deliberate killing of innocents. And this is why, in the end, I will tell to the Council, it's enough. Put an end to the divisions and the hesitations towards Russia and call for the investigation and war crimes for the perpetrators. Thank you very much.
I repeat, the problem will be our votes, so I do ask you to abide by your time. 1 minute, please. Mr. Starbatty.
Herr Präsident Juncker, Sie hoffen durch
President Juncker, I think you're trying to persuade the British persuade the Walloons with nice words, but I hear that Mr. Lamberts is saying the view is very clear. I think that the issue is fundamental. It's not about persuading people. And then Madame Le Pen talking about CETA destroying jobs and reducing growth, that's twaddle. There are economic models. Whether your calculations are positive or negative, they are inaccurate. What we do know is that CETA and TTIP lead to more productivity because there is more competition, but potentially more unemployment if you're not careful. And that's something politicians have to make clear. It's an opportunity, but also a risk, and we have to demonstrate that we can protect ourselves against the risks.
Madam Pagazartundua, 1 minute.
Sí, muchas gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. The conclusions adopted by the Council over the last 18 months couldn't even fill 100 pages. 18 months ago, the Council deplored the lack of measures taken in the Mediterranean. It talked about the need for an effective asylum policy. Back then, we were waiting for the Juncker plan. We talked about the migrant and refugee crisis. Just a few months ago, those words disappeared. We started talking about the migration crisis, immigrants and illegal immigrants. This Council has gone even further. Now, we talk about dealing with other elements of our global strategy. The other elements are women and children who can't go to school in Greece, a human buffer zone. People tell us that life on Lesbos has become completely unbearable. The Council is responsible for that. Let's not forget it. Unfortunately, Mr. Juncker, I wish it weren't true, but you're also complicit in this. All those people who are draining in the Mediterranean, obviously that's not your fault, but this policy which we're proposing, it leads to an insoluble situation.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Tusk, Mr. Juncker, Greece and Italy, concerning the migration issue, they need a real, genuine solidarity, not solidarity à la carte, not flexible solidarity, not the solidarity that Mr. Orban allows you to show. So, Mr. Juncker, Mr. Tusk, you should be stricter concerning the Europe à la carte. You shouldn't be sweet to him because he belongs to the European, to the PPE, to European Popular Party. We cannot accept a Europe à la carte where, on the one hand, Poland and Hungary take European funding, but they don't want any refugees. There should be no bullying against the authorities of Wallonia. Their anxieties, their concerns are real, and they could change CETA towards trade, not just free, but fair as well. We are tired of listening to declarations. We want real solidarity and a Europe with a plan and cohesion.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Mr. Juncker, Mr. Tusk, you're speaking on behalf of the workers on CETA. Well, if you listen to the workers, they don't want CETA. If you want to speak on behalf of consumers, they don't want CETA either. You claim to speak on behalf of Europe's citizens. But what do you tell them when, on endocrine disruptors, it seems that we're prepared to damage Europe? What are you going to say to Europe's citizens when Europe fails to do its job in providing climate leadership? When it's the Canadian tar sands that are going to end up attacking Europe? What are you going to say to Europe's citizens and Europe's farmers when they are decimated by the mistreated Canadian cattle imports full of chemicals and antibiotics? So, are you in favour of just camps for the immigrants, rolling out the red carpet for the far right, ignoring the role of the Court of Justice in improving CETA? I think that you should go to the court. Be coherent.
Minute.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the floor. The CETA agreement with Canada is now rather shaky since that Wallonia has rejected the agreement in its current form. Our country's strong animal protection rules are going to be weakened as a result of the agreement. The dispute settlement rules are bad as well when multinationals have too much power. And Canada has also had problems with shell companies that have already abused these kind of dispute settlement clauses. The whole idea is that it should allow greater exports from my country, but I think that there needs to be a lot more transparency right from the outset, which could have avoided some of the problems that we see now. That's what I would say to Mr. Weber and many others. Europe's peoples are laughing at you and your constant pie casting. Pie throwing. It seems that we are simply playing in the sand pit with but you just squabbling. That seems to be your version of democracy. Thanks.
Mr. WILIMSKY, 1 minute.
Vielen Dank, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Die Republik Österreich.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a national holiday in Austria today. The Austrian nation are a proud people who believe in democracy and the rule of law. Today is a celebration thereof. I see in the European Union, in the last summit, I see major problems in the whole area of sovereignty. I'm thinking specifically in terms of the CETA free trade agreement, which infringes the right of people to co-decide. We had a poll in Austria, and there was a huge majority against this free trade agreement. I would say to the Walloons, don't yield to pressure. Keep up the resistance. It's a last opportunity to stop this. And may I say, long live the Austrian Republic. Thank you for listening to me.
We have a blue card request from Mr. Rubik. Will you accept? Yes. Mr. Rubik.
Danke, Herr Kollege.
Thank you, Mr. WILIMSKY. On our National Day, I think it's worth mentioning that in the socialist vote on CETA, there was a participation rate of just 7%. I would like to thank the Federal Chancellor for accepting that it's the right path to prosperity. You're from the Freedom Party. Why are you against a free trade agreement with Canada?
Eins nach dem anderen, Herr Kollege Rübig.
Thank you, Mr. Rubik. There were just 13% of people in Slovakia that took part in the elections to the European Parliament. The fact is there are democratic votes, and you have to allow people to take part in the democratic process, and you have to accept the outcome of democratic decisions. And it's our job to explain things to people, to get them on board. Of course we're in favour of trade, but we also need the proper regulation and respect for sovereignty.
Colleagues, I've checked on time, and I'm now going to announce that we will not be able to take any more blue cards in this debate. And now Mr. Balczó for 1 minute, please.
Elnök asszony, köszönöm a szót. Az Unió...
Madam President, thank you. The main point in the conclusions is migration. We have a reference to the new Schengen Code on border control, designed to stem the flow of migrants and to ensure that as many possible people can be returned. The conclusions also note that migration should primarily be tackled in the country of origin. These are good things, but the real question we have to address is what can we do in practice? The Council refuses to concede that we have failed. We have this compulsory quota for resettlement, and we simply can't continue as we have up until now. In December we'll have to talk about this again. I think those responsible here are political leaders who have sent out messages creating the problems leading to millions of economic migrants flooding into Europe.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Well, migration challenges. The French government is finding it very difficult to relocate the inhabitants of the Calais camp. It seems that we're trying desperately to catch up with events. And we're failing to pursue the trade agreements even when we should be leading it. The whole of Europe is being held hostage by Wallonia, but it's all lies, hypocrisy, political posturing. That seems to be what dominates. We're stuck in an irrational situation. Paul Magnette is asking for guarantees on human rights from Canada. I think that is the summit of the absurd. They're trying to explain to us that our companies should be able to get into the Canadian public procurement market, that our geographical indications should be protected. I mean, who is more credible at the end of the day? The politicians, the NGOs, the companies? It seems that there's a lack of awareness, a lack of involvement in the member states in terms of defending our trade agreements. That means that we all end up, at the end of the day, losing credibility. Yes, we need to get the right idea of protection, not protectionism. We need to be pragmatic in defending our interests. If we let the rest of the world define the rules in our place, then we will end up losing out. Conclusions of the Council without any content will lead us into this situation inevitably.
Mr. Guerrero.
Thank you. I've been a member of this House for some years now. I've come to the conclusion that a semiologist, even an amateur semiologist, is better placed to understand and interpret the results of European Council meetings than a member of the European Parliament. If that semiologist were to read the Spanish language version of the Council conclusions, he would note that the terms controlled and returns are cited as many as 14 times. And the word prevent is mentioned just twice. Quite striking. So we talk about trying to regulate arrivals, But above all, we have to try to help stop people leaving their countries of origin. To prevent them leaving their countries of origin, the European Union has to step up to the plate as a global actor. It has to intervene via the global strategy, via the Migration Pact, via foreign investment, and via stepping up our ability to develop our security and defence policies. Mr. Juncker and the President of the European Council have taken small steps forward, including agreements with African leaders. However, it's not yet enough. We have to go further. The European Union has to become an important player, a relevant player when it comes to guaranteeing humanitarian aid where barbaric acts are taking place. Access for emergency medical aid to Aleppo, giving the long-suffering citizens of Aleppo under constant bombardment to get some reprieve. Another question is the whole issue of youth unemployment. There's a chapter in the conclusions, point 19, other issues. However, in reality, this is a question of paramount importance for the European Union. We can't simply be resigned about this problem. We can't simply wait till December or next February before we start achieving results.
1 minute.
Dank u wel, mevrouw de voorzitter.
Thank you, Madam President. A great deal remains to be done to complete this trade agreement with Canada. Everybody's ready to sign except Wallonia, Paul Magnette and the PS, the Parti Socialiste. They say that this agreement will lead to multinationals writing our law. There's nothing about that in the agreement. They say that our environmental legislation will be sidelined. There's nothing about that in the agreement, nor on health. They say that jobs will be lost on our employment markets. None of that's in the agreement. It's a load of rubbish. What I've heard now is that apparently the PS is ready to change its mind, to withdraw its veto, and to give its agreement. The suggestion has also been made that they will try to cover themselves with an additional agreement which contains nothing new. All that will be in that agreement is the wording which is already in the text. So if that were to happen, ladies and gentlemen, I think it will become strikingly clear to everybody what this Belgian PS actually is. A political party which prefers indulging in its own egotistical political games rather than European cooperation.
I apologise, Mr. Tarabella. I have announced there are no blue cards because we have time problems. So thank you for your understanding. 1 minute. Madame de Sarnez.
Merci. Ce qui se passe en
Thank you. What's happening in Wallonia should not just be swept aside. It's something that deserves analysis and should be understood so as to develop a new perspective. First of all, there is a huge need for protection that has to be heard. Jobs and the European way of life cannot be variables in an international trade context. Free trade can't be a be-all and end-all proposed to the people. Secondly, the EU's trade policy has to come out of its naivety. We can't carry on with these ineffective anti-dumping rules and the most open market in the world. We really do need trade defence instruments worthy of the name, and it is time for us to be much more demanding in our relations with China. Trade policy and the defence of our strategic interests go hand in hand, just as they do in the United States.
1 minute, Mrs. Anderson.
On Monday night I spoke about Brexit and its impact on Ireland's Good Friday Agreement. This morning I will focus on desperate refugees who are dying at the border of the EU, yet the Council recommits itself to keeping them out rather than keeping them safe. Rather than reassess the current obvious failings of Europe's asylum policy, the Council seems content to continue with more of the same. Over 70,000 refugees remain stranded at Europe's borders. Almost 40,000 men, women, little boys and little girls lie at the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea. The EU-Turkey deal, agreed 6 months ago, has failed all tests in relation to humanity and effectiveness. Turkey has experienced a so-called coup and a criminal clampdown by the state. Turkey is not a safe country. Ask the Kurds, ask the journalists, ask political opponents of the regime, ask the Syrian child refugees being forced to work in Turkey's factories for €1 an hour. Europe and the EU needs to do much more about this humanitarian crisis.
Mrs. Lunacek, 1 minute.
Madam President, Commission, Council, colleagues, walls, blockades, cutting off, isolation. It seems that that's the summary of this summit and its decisions, particularly with regard to migration. It is set down in law that money for development ought to be going into the rule of law or development and things like that, but rather they are being misused to carry out European migration management. We as the European Union are not in a position, it appears, to properly distribute these refugees across the continent. A lot of development NGOs that you've heard of, Caritas, CARE, others, I mean, maybe occasionally you talk to them in the Council and Mr. Tusk. They have warned us that return agreements and migration management ends up playing into the hands of dictators. Corruption, authoritarianism are all being promoted by these kinds of agreements. Thank you very much.
Mr. Juncker, Mr. Tusk, we are talking about free trade agreements while the largest trading companies seem to be running the race of who will be the first to increase the prices of major commodities. We are talking about trade agreements with the US and Canada, but we do not have enough safeguards or measures for job creation or for keeping the existing ones. We are talking about peace in Syria and encourage the fighting parties to hold ceasefire, but while we talk, we are not bold at the same time to take action to eliminate the reasons of the war. No results were achieved during the negotiations on the implementation of the peace agreements in Ukraine. Chairman, we are continuously trying to create a safe future of Europe by words only. However, the future can be created by action rather than words. An iceberg is drifting towards Europe like towards the notorious Titanic, which also seemed unsinkable. It's a huge iceberg of words, bureaucracy and inaction. Thank you.
Mr. Borghezio, 1 minute.
Well, we talk about defending the European Union. You're defending Hungary by building a wall, defending Spain at Ceuta and Melilla. We're putting a 4-meter high fence. Are these successes? Well, what about small Italian villages that have had to reject these invasions? We've had similar things in France when they've tried to distribute these clandestine migrants. There is a promise in the Council conclusions to relocate 160,000 migrants, but in Sicily you got 4,000 arriving every day. So what are we to think? Is it only Italy that's obliged to receive all of these immigrants? How can you imagine 160,000 being relocated? I think that we haven't seen much progress so far. I think it's shameful that the Council is talking in these terms. And what about the agreements with Africa? We're waiting for a response from the High Commissioner, but at the same time that the invasion is continuing.
Madam President, we find ourselves at a moment in which Brexit become a model and a method. The European Union is now described as a project which is reversible, and the migrant crisis shows that our solidarity is cruelly lacking. Moreover, we now blocked an agreement with our good friends Canada. If we're not able to complete an agreement even with Canada, we won't be able to sign any more free trade agreements. Free trade will continue, but we won't be part of it. That means less prosperity, less employment, and less well-being. There's no point in a region with just 2 million inhabitants being allowed to block the interests of a continent with 500 million inhabitants. Democracy is a two-way street. The values of the majority should also always prevail over the interests of a minority. What we're talking about here, globalization, is not an ideology. People who are opposed to globalization do so using mobile phones produced by people in Mexico, China, Japan, France, Israel, Malta and Belgium. That's a real contradiction in what they're saying. Globalization is a fact. It's not an ideology. Opposing globalization means opposing the movement of time. It's in effect being reactionary. We're talking about complex problems which require complex solutions. In a complex modern world, politicians who use childish solutions are in effect politically sick.
Minute, Madam Toya.
Well, we've heard a lot about numbers. That's what I'll be talking about. This year in Italy, 153,000 people arrived. 20,000 of them minors. That's a record. It's also a record for deaths. They've tripled. Now, just to let our French colleagues understand, we have a Calais every single week arriving.
Sorry, excuse me, madam. Gentlemen in the front row, could I ask colleagues in the front row?
My time is...
I know it's a very good discussion, and it's really good that people are engaging, but we have a speaker, and you have the floor. Thank you, madam.
Well, I think we should put an end to these incremental increases that we've seen. Have a look at the Italian budget with the necessary understanding. We have a lot of costs. Integrating people costs, looking after children costs money. This is money that supports Europe. So I think that this needs to be recognized in the case of Italy, that these are important choices. Either you let people die or you pay the costs in financial terms and budgetary terms as well. I've heard some very undignified language in this House. There's anti-European demagogy that's attacking social Europe. Vice President Timmermans, wouldn't you agree that Italy is doing its part? And when it comes to the budgetary rules, what will the sanctions be for the countries that refuse to take refugees?
Dankeschön. Sehr geehrter Herr Timmermans.
Mr. Timmermans, the European Central Bank has been buying up government debt in breach of the treaties. At the same time, the European Central Bank has put interest rates at zero. There's an unlimited amount of money that doesn't cost anything. It's therefore no surprise that big countries like France, Italy and Spain are building up new levels of debt, and you support them. There's almost nothing the Commission is doing to stop this growing debt. We are heading for catastrophe. It may last some years, but this destructive policy is eventually going to break up our common currency. Thank you.
1 minute, Madam Bilbao.
Thank you, Madam President. The recent European Council summit and the conclusions in the so-called Bratislava roadmap could be the source of hope. But in yesterday's debate on 2016 budgetary priorities, we saw once again the enormous gulf between the fine words of leaders and their acts. We in the European Union now need leadership. It's not just enough to have a declaration of intent. Syria is descending in flames, and we can't count on Russia. Similarly, we have to respond to the crisis of migration and refugees. Similar problems emerge in energy and digital markets, resurrecting our social model, in particular providing youth guarantees in the fight against poverty. States have not been complying with the priorities they set when it comes to strategic investment or in concluding trade agreements, as we've seen with the CETA crisis. We are facing external dumping, and the European Union is caught up in a political logjam. And that's the best way of opening an enormous boulevard to all these populists.
People of Wallonia said no to tyranny by rejecting CETA. Also, and contrary to what Ms Voutmans said in relation to all countries supporting it, in the last week Ireland's upper house, the Seanad, rejected this deal. Let's be clear though, the EU hierarchy does not care what the general public thinks. I hear talk of breaking the deadlocks. But translated, what that means is, we will break your country unless you do what you're told. And I know the reality of that. I'm from Ireland, where we were bullied for voting for Nice and then again with Lisbon. Their argument is that if you vote no, then you don't understand. If you vote yes, then you're enlightened. The reality is this. The EU and Canada already have judicial systems that offer rights and protections equally to all its citizens, companies and corporations, with appeals possible all the way to the Supreme Court or the European Court of Justice. Mr Pittella talks about peddling. Here we have another type of peddling, the peddling of lies. ISDS and ICS are one of the same. If you change the label on a tin of Lidl cat food to one for caviar, it does not change its contents. Still has the same rubbish within.
Thank you. 1 minute, Mr Pretzel.
Meine Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen, today Mr Juncker declared that rejection of CETA is protectionism, but rather protectionism is something that you're very much in favour of for European steel. That would seem to be a contradiction in terms, but in fact it's just the consistent continuation of the policies that have been pursued by the European Union. What you're really doing is you're pursuing protectionism to the benefit of large companies and at the expense of small and medium-sized companies. That is the policy of the European Union, not only in trade agreements, but also in the single market rules. On the Dublin Agreement is supposed to be reviewed, but countries in advance are refusing to follow it. At least not to an extent that would be relevant in any way. So, ladies and gentlemen, can you finally realise that the European Union, with further deepening, will not actually lead to an improvement? I think that we need a return to the single market and the single market alone.
1.5 minutes, Mrs Gardini.
Sì, grazie Presidente. Finalmente.
Thank you, President. Finally, I repeat, finally, I've heard this House talking about the central Mediterranean, about the Africa-Italy route. The situation hasn't improved. In fact, it's actually got worse. This year, we've been faced with a record number of arrivals. Not only have we beaten last year's record, we've also beaten the 2014 record. The number of people arriving has grown in Italy. So, finally, the Council has recognised the fact that we need specific measures and a specific effort to try to enable us to tackle illegal immigration within a very short time frame and stabilise the Eastern Mediterranean. We've seen so many pointless deaths, so many. We have to bring that to an end and give a sense of security to our citizens. At the same time, however, we also have to see economic advantages. If we can't achieve stability, investors will not put their money in Europe. They will choose to invest elsewhere in the world. Moreover, more and more of them are doing just that. Whereas we have to find a way back to growth, we have to create new jobs, we have to create a future for our young people. This is why we, in the Italian delegation, have always insisted, for example, that we are against recognition for China of its market economy status. It simply doesn't have such a market economy. Nor can we afford to abandon our objective of 20% of GDP coming from the manufacturing centre by 2020. We have to defend the real economy. Without industry, without SMEs, we will never find a way out of this crisis.
1 minute, Mrs. Wilmot.
President, last week's Council meeting was attended by the UK Prime Minister Theresa May for the first time. If she was hoping for an easy ride, then she was sadly mistaken, with a warning from François Hollande that a hard Brexit would mean hard negotiations. Not the pick and mix many had hoped for or had alluded to during the referendum campaign. The reality is Britain's future prosperity depends on having sensible negotiations with other EU countries, not the chaos some would advocate. Membership of the single market, on which many jobs depend, is surely crucial for our economy. The resulting uncertainty has already seen the pound plummet, meaning higher food bills, inevitably affecting the most vulnerable in our society. I've been dismayed so far at the tone taken by the British government in regards to upcoming negotiations. We will not succeed in getting the best result for all by threatening, hectoring and lecturing. The Prime Minister needs a plan, and it's clear the UK government doesn't have one. So stop the talk of hard or soft Brexit, because the next steps we take are huge. Let's at least try and take them together.
Thank you. Mrs. Tomacic, 1 minute.
Hvala lijepa. Jedan od glavnih izazova koji se nalaze pred Komisijom jest kako pozicionirati Europsku uniju kao globalnog lidera u trgovini I osigurati.
Thank you. The European Union ought to be a leader in global trade and have a new period of rapid growth, as we saw in Europe after the Second World War. The developments we've seen on CETA have shown that a large number of citizens feel that they are exposed to serious risks from Canada. Well, that would appear to be illusory, and I hope that in the near future we'll be able to sign agreements with the global giants like the USA, Russia and China. Our citizens are losing trust in their politicians, and the Commission has contributed to this because we have done too little to inform our citizens. We have left that up to the populists to take control of the public opinion on TTIP, on CETA and in other areas. The Commission has not managed to convince anyone that this agreement will not simply be for the big corporations, that it will only leave crumbs for the small and medium-sized companies. That is the key issue that should inspire the Commission and our citizens that we represent. Thank you.
Thank you, President. President Tusk, you said last week's Council was not a crisis meeting. Well, I believe the lack of common positions, even in light of the worst crises, war and the migration it causes, is a crisis of political leadership that does not escape our citizens. Trade may be the next victim, and the EU's ability and credibility to negotiate agreements at all is on the line. Regardless of whether the socialist Walloon cliffhanger ends at a last-minute solution, a lot of damage is done. The world is watching this stumbling, and I wonder whether anyone looks at this bigger picture and the longer-term impact. What is clear is the need for more engagement with NGOs and citizens by those giving a unanimous mandate to the Commission, the Council, a mandate that is a logical consequence of leveraging the single market not only for global economic gains but also to raise the bar of standards. It is Council, Member States individually, that have to mitigate the negative consequences, but I hear very few leaders explain this. I think criticism has had too much space because of an absence of leadership, and if you do not qualify that as a crisis now, please don't wait until it is, and don't let cooperation with Canada be the reason for it.
1.5 minutes, Mrs. Galpelch.
Köszönöm, elnök asszony, tisztelt elnök úr, alelnök úr, biztos úr.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. President, Mr. Vice President, for a year and a half now, migration has been an evergreen subject at the European Council meetings. Finally, we've heard that protection of the Schengen border is a priority. Finally, we have heard that the problem should be resolved elsewhere and not imported into the EU. That means you have taken a step forward. Binding quotas are not a solution, though. 98% of the citizens of Hungary who voted against quotas. We should concentrate on our common policies like investment policy. We need to highlight the fact that we're going to lose out on investment opportunities if we don't solve the migration problem. We need to think about ways for our member states to develop, if appropriate, to develop differently. Above all, we must listen to citizens and parliaments. Thank you.
Mr. Tsani, 1 minute.
Köszönöm szépen a lehetőséget, tisztelt elnök asszony.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak, Madam President. I'm following on the heels of another Hungarian speaker, so now I get the chance to express my views on this situation. If you're a Hungarian citizen and you were to observe how the European Council is portrayed in the media, you would read that the Prime Minister Orbán has pretty much defeated all of the other heads of state and acted like a hero in preventing Mr. Juncker from sending a whole horde of terrorists into Hungary. Well, that is the kind of interpretation you'll hear from Hungary at the moment. If we are going to contradict these kinds of depictions, then I think more needs to be done. We need to tell Europe's citizens what is happening in reality.
Minutes now, Mr. Niedermayer.
Thank you very much. Good morning, dear colleagues. Just a few remarks on Council agenda. First of all, on migration, I guess we must understand that the problem is not over. Just look at the data and look at the pictures from Italy and Greece. Pressure is lower, but I call on Council not to underestimate the situation and not to repeat the mistakes that we were doing in last months. We must act, and we must act together. That's the only way how to solve the issue. The second, let me express surprise about behaviour on Commission and Council in the case of creating the trade defence instruments for Europe. We know for many years that in December there is a change of our relation to China, and it was said not only by this House that we must react. I am surprised that debate is taking place only now. Last, on Russia, I guess even a few hours after Council meeting we can see that we made a mistake, that our policy don't work. It's costing the lives, and it's not getting us closer to the solution. And I am not want to remind you of the situation in Ukraine that is tragic. So I call on the Council to act clearly, decisively and responsibly. Last, let me say that many speakers in this House talk about the democracy and voice of people. If I understand correctly, 28 out of the 28 government of member states are supporting CETA agreements. And I don't want to remind you in history, for example, of my communist country, what was the voice of people. So please be responsible. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Bonafè, 1 minute.
Presidente Pittella, poco fa, per descrivere I risultati.
Mr. Pittella, in describing the results of the European Council, invoked the words of Romano Prodi. We need to pedal our bikes in order to make any progress, in order to get ahead. I'd like to invoke what Pietro Nenni said. He said in one of his last speeches that we need to keep innovating or we will perish. And that, I think, is what we have to keep in mind. We have to recognize there's no point in routine and ordinary European councils. We've got epoch-making challenges to face. Migration, refugees, financial problems that flow in their wake. Some countries like Italy have huge challenges and we have to face them, but we want an equitable sharing out of the burden. We want partnership with Africa and with our fellow member states. We want partnership with countries of transit and countries of origin. But we have to face up to problems of employment, social security, and we need to give some opportunities to our own citizens to live a life in dignity and with prospects for the future. Therefore, we need a better employment policy as well. Thank you.
Thank you. 1.5 minutes, Mr. Rangel.
Thank you, Chair. Eu gostaria de começar.
I'd like to begin by referring to the CETA agreement. And let me make the following point. I fail to understand how in this House there are so many people who are worried with CETA, beginning with the Greens. Because that's what Marine Le Pen wants, that's what Donald Trump wants, that's what Farage wants. They want to get rid of free trade. Are we here to serve protectionism? Even those that have an open vision of the world are hostage to this kind of protectionism. Do they want that? They're there with Farage, Trump and Le Pen in opposing CETA. We've got to be clear about this. There's never been a trade agreement which has better standards for protecting social standards and environments. They're really daring and well developed. Nobody started complaining about the Vietnam agreement, and there are problems there, particularly with children, with women and with working hours. There are problems with the environment, but nobody seemed to worry about that. But with Canada, we managed to reach an agreement which is a model for all trade partnerships in the world, and now we're trying to unpick that agreement. It's unraveling. And also watch out for the agreement with Ukraine. And here a word to our Dutch friends, because it's important to beef up sanctions against Russia. And this, I'm saying this to the Portuguese government that wants to get rid of sanctions against Russia. But what can we do to pressure Russia? Well, the best thing we can do is have a free trade agreement with the Ukraine. That really is going to be the most important way to pressure Putin and his crowd.
I'm sorry. 1 minute.
President, the heart and soul of the European Union is peace, diplomacy and dialogue. Likewise, the nuclear agreement with Iran, it was Europe at its best. Now, Russia is in trouble now because there's been a paradigm shift, but it doesn't want any rapprochement with Europe. But nonetheless, Europe must seek some rapprochement with Russia and do everything it possibly can to defend European interests. See, without forgetting Crimea, it's a crime against international law, but leaving that aside, we've got to start a new Helsinki process. I'm very satisfied indeed that at the Council the barbaric acts of Aleppo were strongly condemned, and if the war continues in Syria, this area is going to be the burial place of Western civilization. We can't accept that. Thank you.
Madam Zaborska, 1.5 minutes.
President, various of my colleagues have expressed dissatisfaction with regard to the latest meeting of the Council, and I understand that there have been unfulfilled expectations. Such as Manfred WEBER has said, the Commission comes up with proposals, this Parliament is ready to approve those, but what is missing is the ability of the Member States to reach agreements. And then, of course, the failure to act, and act with determination that is expected by us and by the citizens. Let me point out an important thing. An agreement between countries hardly happens overnight. And when I was listening to statements by President Tusk and President Juncker, I understood there were important messages. One of those were the Member States simply had not been ready to reach agreement on everything. And that's a pity. And of course, it's quite clear that the Prime Ministers of Member States did meet, and it seems they have to meet again, or again and again, before they reach an agreement. Dear colleagues, good agreements take time. So let's take time and let's give this time to the Council, because compromises which are not prepared well are those that have caused the majority of the problems that we face in Europe today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mavrides, 1 minute.
Thank you, Chair. I am going to focus on one point only, and I would like to address myself to the Commission. The evaluation report of the 72 criteria for the liberalization of visa to Turkey has been approved by the European Commission, and based on that there are only 7 criteria left out of the 72. So, I would like to ask the Commission, within the criteria that have been fulfilled, there are certain serious issues that concern the Republic of Cyprus. However, Erdogan does not apply those criteria. I'm only going to mention 2 points. How is Turkey applying the cooperation agreement on border management when they are at the same time claiming the territorial waters of the Republic of Cyprus? And how are the justicial authorities cooperating when they're not even recognizing the Republic of Cyprus? So my question is simple. Have you even read this report?
Mrs. Šuica, 1.5 minutes.
Gospodine Tusk, gospodine Timmermans, činjenica je da smo na početku ove migrantske krize postavili pitanje I rekli da moramo biti solidarni I odgovorni.
We need to show solidarity and be responsible. We've got to ask ourselves whether we genuinely have been. Europeans today feel uncertain because of migration, because of CETA, for all sorts of other reasons. So we've got to do everything we possibly can to ensure the Council and Commission decisions are actually implemented. That requires every effort on our part. We must ensure that the agreement with Turkey remains in place because it managed to close off the Western Balkan route. And today, we're getting 10 migrants a day, where previously it was 1,000. So the Commission and Council decisions actually have to be implemented. Europeans feel uncertain. They feel troubled. Why? Because decisions agreed on are not actually implemented. They're not acted on. And that's something we've really got to focus on. And also, we've got to get rid of these bogus arguments against CETA. I mean, some people fail to grasp that globalization is a fact, that we've accepted it. But we've got to be actors. We've got to be active in globalization. And I want the European External Action Service to play a more robust role, and also for the High Representative to have more competences. Now, it is, of course, also true to say that migration problems are closely related to problems in the countries of origin, and it's at the countries of origin that we need to tackle things. But here the European Union has to be a major international player, so I hope the European Commission and Council will keep working with us. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mrs. Kenga.
Grazie. Thank you very much indeed. Another European Council, another focus on migration. The commitments that have been made need to be more than just a commitment on paper. There is no more time. Action has got to follow swiftly on words. We've heard from the populists all too much. We need to have a new European policy on migration which really works. A global policy which is based on the principle of solidarity and a fair sharing of responsibilities across all the member states. We must make sure, as I say, that we transform words into actions, real action. There are many asylum seekers in Greece and in Italy, and we must ensure that they are able to move on smoothly to other countries once their application has been processed. The Migration Compact has got to work for everybody and has got to tackle the root causes of migration. It has to ensure that the European Investment Plan brings enough investment to stop migration and to promote economic development and investment.
1.5 minutes.
Herr Präsident des Europäischen Rates.
Madam President, Mr. President in Office, Mr. President of Council, A couple of points. The situation in Syria and Council's inability to react, and also the realization that we're no longer at a negotiating table makes it clear to me that the Bratislava process has to be a success. In December, there's to be the summit on defense and foreign policy. If we want a role as global player, we also shouldn't overdo our global payer status. The second point I'd make relates to CETA. It's more than just about CETA now, isn't it? The European Union, nobody looks at the bigger picture. We just seem to look at it from our own corner. The Canadian minister has to go and visit German politicians, and then everyone's got to look at their own interests. And really, there are just as many difficulties in many areas. We need greater knowledge that we can look at the greater picture, the greater good. And that means we've got to use the instruments that we have. And majority decision is an instrument of democracy. It guarantees efficiency. But unanimity is an instrument of blackmail and inability. We shouldn't have mixed agreements any longer. We should have a European treaty. And that means that the member states should protect the Commission when it makes protects and defend itself, because it's in their own interest. Thank you.
Mrs. Mitzi, 1 minute, please.
Grazie, signor Presidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was glad to see that last week in its conclusions the Council strongly condemned the attacks on civilians in Aleppo, calling for immediate cessations of hostilities and for resumption of credible political process under the UN auspices. Regrettably, following an expiry of a brief ceasefire and only 2 days after the Council conclusions, the fighting in Aleppo has intensified again. I speak about Aleppo today because we can't ignore what's happening there. I can't ignore this human tragedy that's turning Aleppo into a doomed city with 300,000 civilians trapped and deliberately deprived of water, food, supplies and limited medical care in underground hospital. Even worse, 100,000 of those civilians trapped in the city are children exposed every day to extreme suffering and terror of falling bombs. The situation is unacceptable and we need more decisive actions to stop these, to bring an end to these atrocities, to agree to a ceasefire and to open humanitarian channels to allow delivery of humanitarian aid and evacuation of patients.
1 minute, Mr. Bellet.
Hartelijk dank, mevrouw de voorzitter, meneer de vicevoorzitter.
Thank you very much, President. Vice President, I agree with the previous speaker. We deeply need an initiative in Aleppo to bring this war to an end. Secondly, CETA, we need to ensure that we recognize that social and environmental and labour standards are very important. They have to be respected and protected. We all agree with that, but we have the guarantees in the text. They've also been further clarified day by day in recent weeks, and therefore it is high time that we signed off this agreement, that we could actually make some progress. I'm sure that we have our trust in you and can justly place our trust in you. I would appeal to our Wallonian colleagues, please, to step up and agree to sign this agreement. And colleagues, on a wider level, I think what Mr. Brok has said is very apposite. We can do a great deal. We can really make achievements in Europe, and therefore we need to focus on doing that and not listening to and being put off by the people propagating dissent on the right of the chamber. It's high time that we recognise that there is so much that we can do, and that, yes, national and regional parliaments are important, but we do need to get behind an ambitious agreement which will serve the interests of the peoples of Europe and is endorsed by the majority of this House. Thank you.
1 minute, Mrs. Peary.
Thank you very much, President. More controls at sea, tighter borders. Migration is being described as illegal, and that's the message that is coming out of the European Council regarding refugees. Freedom and protection of human rights and respect of the constitutional state are actually the cornerstones of our foreign policy, and yet there is too much of a focus on simply keeping out the flows of refugees and nothing more. Last week there was further focus on the implementation and compliance with the EU-Turkey deal. But unfortunately, the original goal of the agreement has been lost sight of. The original idea was to bring to an end illegal and dangerous immigration over routes into the European Union that were extremely dangerous, and therefore it is important that the European Council restate that in its conclusions. We have to show what our values are. We also need to show that we take our values seriously ourselves and that we're a reliable and trustworthy partner for other countries. We need to live up to our own commitments first and foremost. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Manica, 1 minute.
Ďakujem. Thank you. The role of the European Council is to direct and guide Europe. Without helping Africa to create jobs, we won't be able to resolve the reasons for migration. The UN expects the increase of this continent from the present 1.2 billion to 4 billion by the end of the century. It would be a development catastrophe. There would be a threat of insufficient food, and it would be a migration disaster. We can do most favor to Africa and to Europe when we protect children from malaria, when we eliminate Ebola, and when we stimulate investments and creation of jobs, and when we allow girls to obtain secondary education. Concerning the agreement with Canada and USA, the resistance to these agreements is to blame to politicians. They cannot hide behind the European Council, and that way they give room to populists. The leaders must clearly tell why we need the trade and why it is positive.
Thank you. Madam Gomez, 1 minute.
How can we account for the fact that the Council meets on the migration crisis and yet the conclusions don't refer to refugees yet one time, to asylum, to fundamental rights, to safe routes? Because basically we're handing over management of the crisis to traffickers. What kind of Europe is this? It's absolutely obsessed with protecting its borders. People are threatening it. I mean, basically politics is about how many people return, and of course we're defending the illegal pact with Turkey. We have partners that have oppressive regimes such as Ethiopia, where there's misery and oppression which leads to refugees leaving the country. There were times when I've criticized Council for failing to act, but now I'm genuinely scared. The path from Bratislava is anti-European. It's a full frontal attack to our security today and the security and safety of future generations. Today, we have a Europe of defense, but it's defined by but it's not defined by European values. We've got to make Russia understand that continued aggression against Ukraine and the merciless bombing of Aleppo cannot go unpunished. Thank you.
Colleagues, we now come to Catch the Eye, and there will be disappointed people in the chamber, for which I apologise. And I give the floor for 1 minute, and I will be strict on time, to Mr. Grzyb. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think that the three topics that were outlined by Mr. Tusk, migration, trade, Russia, these are the most important issues. These are very emotional, and I think, however, I do think that the problem of migration stands out. However, the news is good. We have fewer and fewer people arriving in Greece. There is also good results coming from the cooperation with African countries. We have to act in the countries of origin, and the next issue is the issue of the protection of borders. This is very important issue. We have to regulate this problem by way of better managing our borders. And then the issue of trade, not only CETA, but we also have to act in order to fight dumping. This is very important for the development of our industry, and especially steel industry. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. López Aguilar.
Sure. I've paid a lot of attention to the chapter of immigration at this European Council, and of course what strikes me is the positive assessment that's made of this terrible deal with Turkey. The Council has ignored the negative assessment of this Parliament, and then he talked It talked about the effects after the coup d'etat, where so many journalists were in prison. And of course, the Council, I think, is still showing a negative attitude to these migrants arriving on Europe's shores, women, children, and the migratory pressure is unrelenting. And with Turkey, we're supposed to be trying to strengthening solidarity with Greece and Italy, and then nothing about this anti-European referendum that was carried out in Hungary on the 2nd of October.
Yes.
Mr. Tusk, I'm going to refer to you, so please have the translation.
You spoke about Greece just for 10 seconds. Do you think that the issue of migration is over now? Do you have any idea what is going on in the islands of the Aegean right now? Do you have any idea that there are 14,000 people trapped there? There are only 7,000 places for those people. Do you know that Greece is not even allowed to transfer those people from the islands to the mainland? Out of the 6,000 transfers of those people to the EU, the 60,000 transfers of those people to the EU, only 5,000 have taken place. Is this really an acceptable situation? And you only spoke about this for 10 seconds. Moreover, you want through Dublin III to return those people from Germany to Greece because they entered through Greece. This is unacceptable.
Mr. Jakovic has the floor for 1 minute.
Migrantska kriza definitivno ruši temelje Europske unije. Rješavanje...
Well, the solution of the problems of Frontex, of the problems with Turkey, are undoubtedly things that we have to welcome. But the problem isn't going to be solved if we're not showing solidarity with ourselves. We can't just ignore what's happening in Greece, for example, or what's happening in Italy. Without solidarity among the member states of Europe, the integration of the EU makes no sense, because the migration crisis, one day it's going to be greater, one day it's going to be lesser. And of course the Western Balkan route now has been closed, but migration is going to be stopped. And since we're talking about this route through the Western Balkans, I'd like to say that it's shameful what the Slovenian government is doing, who is putting up barbed wire against Croatia. It's not only Wallonia. The Council has closed its eyes to the opposition in the streets and in certain parliaments, and I'd like to give you another date. More than 2,000 cities and regions in Europe have declared themselves as zones free of CETA and the TTIP, and this has to be taken account of. So it's not just Wallonia. And then something about the arrival of migrants and refugees to Europe. The European Commission is pleased because there are fewer coming from Turkey, and therefore fewer people are dying in the Aegean. But the Commission is ignoring the negative side of this, the terrible conditions in the countries that they're trying to leave, and the 3,640 people who have died in the Mediterranean this year.
Madam Winberg.
Thank you, Chair. Well, we heard Mr. Weber talk about a bicycle that you have to pedal if you want to go forward. But I would suggest that Mr. Weber and other people put the brakes on and park their bicycle. I would rather say that the EU is like a punctured tire and you can't repair the bicycle anymore. Everything you do is artificial respiration. We want to have a new Frontex. We want to reform the Dublin Agreement. We want new mechanisms to distribute migrants. But the question is whether the people in the member states really know what you're doing. But I can follow the UK's decision. I'd like to have a referendum in my country too to leave this construction.
Epitideos.
Thank you, Chair. As expected, the Council did not take any substantial decision for the problems of the EU. On the migration issues, the various presidents are happy because the flows have gone down. I'm afraid you are not aware of the newer information because they have gone up again, and it's been so for a couple of months. So instead of threatening Turkey with stopping accession talks, they are moving ahead towards visa liberalization, and they are also very happy about the creation of a border and coast guard. However, how are we going to face this problem with this bureaucratical agency that is doing nothing more than providing safe passage for illegal immigrants from Turkey into Greece? We need to have a policy that we deter those people from coming in. And we're only mentioning for Syria, Turkey and no other countries such as the jihadists or the US.
Jetzt im Namen der Kommission Herr Vizepräsident Timmermans.
Now on behalf of the Commission, Vice President Timmermans.
Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Timmermans, warten Sie mal einen Moment.
Could you hold on a minute, sir?
Bitte.
No. Mulțumesc, domnule președinte. Pe regulă.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to draw your attention that we started the debate 10 minutes later, so 10 people cannot take the floor. I was here the first to register for an intervention, so you could delay the debate by 10 minutes because we started later.
Frau Grappini,
Ms. Grappini, I understand your point. But by and large, you're a winner with Catch the Eye. But the procedure has now been concluded, and I've already given the floor to Mr. Timmermans, so please continue, Mr. Timmermans.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a few reflections after the debate in the plenary. First of all, the migration issue. I share the concerns of all those who've raised their worries about what is happening in the southern Mediterranean. It is a tragedy that so many people are still drowning in spite of the tremendous efforts of the Italian authorities to save as many people as possible. We need to have a comprehensive approach about this. And let me be very clear. Better border protection is part of the answer, but it's not a panacea for the migration crisis. If we believe we can hide behind border and fences and rid ourselves of collective solidarity in this issue, we are delusional. Just imagine that in the next generation or two, the population of Africa will be anywhere between 3 and 6 billion people. How do you think the Mediterranean will ever be wide enough or fences ever high enough to stop these people from coming to Europe if we don't have a policy that will offer them perspective in their own nations, in their own continent, in their own cities and villages? So don't believe in the illusion of borders as the only solution to this problem. And don't believe in the illusion that you can rid yourself of collective European solidarity in tackling this huge crisis. If you think you can rid yourself of this solidarity, others will rid themselves also of solidarity, and that will be the end of the European Union. So I believe strongly in a collective approach and a comprehensive approach that addresses all the issues linked to the migration crisis. On CETA, let me just say one thing. If you believe at the beginning of what I would call the fourth industrial revolution, you can protect yourselves from not going into agreements
with parts of the world where they share our values, you are delusional. Look at what's happening in the world's economy. Look how fast the world's economy is changing. We need to have comprehensive agreements with those parts of the world who share our values, who want social protection like we do, who want environmental protection like we do. It's only together that we will face the forces of globalization in a way that will guarantee the rights our citizens demand. And I really call upon the Walloon Parliament to carefully study. Mr. Lambert said that it's the only parliament that has actually read the treaty. Well, I leave that to his own judgment. I fear I don't agree with that assessment. But if they read the explications that have been, the assurances that we've given, the clear indication on social protection, on environmental protection, on assurances that disputes will be dealt with by judges in a way that is in accordance with our legal criteria. If they have studied this, perhaps they can come to a conclusion of this matter. It is clear to me, let me end on this point, it is not an isolated matter that people worry about trade agreements. It's not an isolated matter that people sometimes think that building fences is an answer to our problem. It is an element in a world that is changing so fast that people fear that they've lost control of their destinies. Only by offering answers at a European level so that citizens feel that we can help them and assist them in regaining control of our collective destiny will we find solutions for global problems. Thank you, President.
Mr. Tusk, could you stand by a minute? Thank you, Mr. Timmermans. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd be most grateful if you could take your seats, please, and do so as quietly as you possibly can. Ladies and gentlemen, can I ask you once again to take your seats, please? Please proceed, President of Council.
Danke, Herr Präsident. Thank you for this good and lively debate. I have just a few comments. First on CETA. Many in this House have suggested that we should simply ignore the views of national parliaments on trade agreements. The debate in Belgium and Wallonia's resistance do not result from the belief that the competences of EU institutions regarding trade policy are too limited. Today people would prefer the states and national parliaments to have a bigger influence of the course of things, not smaller. Is it any easier to govern Europe thanks to this? No, of course it isn't. But no one will change the fact that the EU is still the union of the states and not institutions. When it comes to Russia, just one remark. The fears and concerns, for example, on private arbitration, must be addressed, and they are being addressed and explained only now. I trust that after today's talks in Belgium, the climate around CETA and maybe also around next free trade agreements will change for the better. When it comes to Russia, I would like to say two things. First, we must keep unity in our relations with Russia. The building of EU unity is a difficult process, if not to say anesthetic, but there is no alternative. If we want to be effective vis-à-vis Russia, we must stay united as the EU. Second, at the European Council, I backed those who were pushing for a stronger position on Russia's role in Syria. The letter written by Verhofstadt, Harms and Weber was a real support for me. Thank you for your initiative. I want to say to those in this room who were the harshest critics of the European Council for not taking a sufficiently univocal position, that they can help by doing the work both in their political families and in member states. And when it comes to migration, just one remark. I am absolutely aware that the situation in Greece remains critical. It's too early to talk about success, it's clear. But please just imagine what the situation on the Greek islands would look like if not for the decrease in the number of irregular migrants by 98%. Not 9%, not 8%, but 98%, which we managed to achieve. This is the beginning of the process, but this is the only way we can use, also for the central Mediterranean route. And this is why I start to discuss also the positive aspects of our activity. Thank you, Mr. President.
Vielen Dank, Herr Ratspräsident.
Thank you, Mr. President of Council. That concludes the debate. Mr. Hookem has asked to take the floor. Please proceed, Mr. Hookem.
Thank you, Mr. Schulz. Earlier today, Mr. Weber made a defamatory statement against me, which you supported. Can I ask that both you gentlemen leave this building where you don't have parliamentary immunity and repeat those statements so I can take legal action against you?
Herr Abgeordneter
Mr. Hookem. I have forwarded the dossier relating to you to the prosecutor's office in Strasbourg. Any further investigations against you or about you are in the hands of the prosecutor. I can say no more, and I have not communicated anything else to the House. If you want to take steps against me by civil procedure, you can go ahead and do so. Do that here in Strasbourg, in Germany. I would have no problem at all with seeing you in court. I'd be very pleased to do so. Mr. Farage.
I said in this chamber that I felt the French Commissioner, Jacques Barrot, was unsuitable to be a European Commissioner because he'd received a conviction for embezzlement and been suspended from public office. Despite the fact what I said was true, it caused a huge outcry. And I was told that because he'd been amnestied by President Chirac under French law, it was an offence ever in public in France to refer to the incident. So there was a lot of speculation over whether the French police were going to come into this building and arrest me. But the President of the Parliament at the time said, no, that is not the case, because the European Parliament, rather like the United Nations in New York, is an organisation whose buildings are extraterritorial. So that ruling was perfectly clear. How can it be, with that precedent having been set, that you can refer an alleged incident between two MEPs that took place in an official committee room in this Parliament to the French police? Can you please tell us, are these buildings extraterritorial, or are we actually here now in France under French law?
Herr Farage.
Mr. Farage. First of all, we have the rules of procedure, and that is what MEPs are subject to, according to the rules of procedure. Members are bound by minimum standards, and that would include mutual respect. In the last plenary session, Mr. Wolf left the plenary chamber and collapsed on one of the bridges just by the plenary chamber and required immediate medical assistance, which was also provided by colleagues who are qualified doctors. Mr. Wolf was taken to a hospital here in Strasbourg. It became clear from tests there that the collapse was a result of a physical attack on his head. I mean, specifically, he was hit on the head. So, we asked Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf explained the situation from his viewpoint. I forwarded the matter to the relevant committee, the committee that's in charge of the code of conduct for members. The committee recommended that the issue be passed on to the French authorities, to the French prosecutor's office. Why? Yes, we are extraterritorial, but that doesn't mean people cannot be prosecuted for criminal activities. That would be a pretty remarkable conception of extraterritoriality. If crimes are perpetrated in this House, then they are subject to prosecution, subject to the law of the country concerned. Here, France. Mr. Wolf has made a statement. Mr. Hookham, you've made a statement. I am obliged to communicate to the House what I do in this case. If somebody says, I have been attacked and as a result suffered physical harm, and another one says, no, I did not do that, I'm not a judge. What I do is forward this to the French authorities. What I find it regrettable is that as President I have to communicate to the House that one member has struck another. That's the real scandal here.
Herr Lamberts, Sie hatten sich zur
Mr. Lamberts, on a point of order.
Herr Lamberts, Sie hatten sich zur
Mr. Lamberts, on a point of order.
Thank you, President. Well, yesterday we voted on the report of our colleague Sophie in 't Veld on the respect of the rule of law in Europe. And you know that 2 weeks ago the main opposition newspaper was closed down in Hungary. And yesterday we learned right afterwards, after this debate, that this was purchased by a newspaper that is closest to Viktor Orban. So if this parliament doesn't want to look ridiculous, it has to manifest its opposition to this type of procedure. The freedom of the press and having a free press and opposition press is an essential European value.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
So, Herr Abgeordneter Batten, dann begründen Sie bitte zu welchem.
Could you say which rule you're speaking to?
Nein. Of the rules of procedure you refer, please.
Of clarification.
Yeah, it's on now. It's on.
Point of clarification. You said regarding the incident in the Parliament
if I heard you correctly, that you had referred this, or the Parliament had referred it to the French authorities. I'm not an expert on French law, but I've been informed that the only person that can make a complaint about a crime is the victim of the crime. Can you clarify, has the Parliament referred this to the authorities, or has Mr. Wolf referred it to the French police?
So, bitte sehr.
Proceed.
Due questioni.
Two questions. First of all, I would like this House to be given the information as to the fact that the Turkish authorities have arrested the two co-mayors of Diyarbakir. We know that Turkey is a partner of the European Union in a certain way, and therefore I think we can't remain silent in the face of what the Erdogan government is continuing to do to the huge detriment of the Kurdish people. Secondly, I would like to know under what auspices you have exerted pressure on the Wallonian authorities regarding their position on CETA. Thank you.
Wir gehen der Frage hinsichtlich der
Yes, we'll look into this matter on Turkey. I wasn't apprised of the matter. I know that these two mayors had indeed been arrested. We'll look into the matter and the negotiations, but the Belgian federal government and Wallonia are still ongoing. That's all I can tell you for the moment. Ladies and gentlemen. The questions on Mr. Hookham have been sufficiently dealt with. I have told you what we have done on the basis of the rules of procedure. I have nothing further to add.
So, zweitens, meine Damen und
Second, ladies and gentlemen, today
wir haben heute zwei Kollegen, meine Damen.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have two colleagues who are sitting with us in the European Parliament for the last time. Mr. Matthias Groote, who's been elected to the local council, so it's his last day today, so congratulations on your election, Mr. Groote, and I thank you.
Vielen Dank.
Thank you.
Und dann, meine Damen.
And then, ladies and gentlemen, after 22 years as member of the European Parliament, our colleague Richard Howitt is sitting with us for the last time. Mr. Howitt joined us in 1994. Mr. Howitt, thank you very much for your hard work through the years.
Meine Damen und Herren,
ladies and gentlemen,
meine Damen und Herren, der Kollege Howitt, ich weiß dem.
Mr. Howitt is of course sad to leave the European Parliament. He's among those who's fought very hard for the United Kingdom to remain a member of the European Union, and for your hard work on this front, I'd like to thank you, Mr. Howitt. I also know that you wish to say a couple of words of farewell, so by way of an exception, I'll give you the floor, Mr. Howitt.
1 minute, I promise, colleagues, at the end of 22 years. Martin, thank you. Thank you on my last day in the European Parliament to all of you in all of the groups, members and staff, for your friendship and for your cooperation. Thank you to the British Labour Party and to the Socialist and Democrat group, to whom I will remain forever loyal, to my own family sitting in the public gallery, for whom I will be always loyal to. I'm proud to have represented my constituency, the East of England. It really is beautiful. I'm proud, as a working class boy who could never have expected to do so, to have represented my country and our continent. It has been a privilege and an honour to serve. I will always remember being here on the days of EU enlargement and of conflict resolution, of championing business responsibility on behalf of this Parliament, and my new career will be true to those values and principles. I, my party and many in my country argued for Europe, and we will continue to do so. We must take our responsibility for the referendum defeat. And I'm sorry, when I leave this building, I do not expect to return as an MEP. But if my country makes the historic mistake of leaving the European Union, I look forward to the day when it will return.
Bravo.
Colleghe e colleghi, buongiorno.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It is now time for us to move on to the vote. I would remind you, because I'm sure you've already been forewarned, that the vote is going to be long today. We will be voting first and foremost on the budget, and we will begin with the Parliament's 2017 draft budget. The two rapporteurs for the budget have, for the Union and for the Parliament, have requested to take the floor, and therefore I shall first of all give the floor to Mr. Geyer.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, I must crave your indulgence for a couple of minutes before we move on to the vote. I'm rapporteur for the 2017 Commission, so I have a brief statement to read out to you. It's basically about 2 or 3 technical corrections. On the 17th of October, the Commission adopted an amending letter. In addition to the traditional updating of agriculture and fishery expenditure, this amending letter also includes important aspects of the midterm review of the multi-annual financial framework 2014-2020. This amending letter shows how fundamentally intertwined the 2017 budget is with the revision of the multi-annual financial framework. The European Parliament would expect the from the Council to finally say something and to become active in conciliation. The European Parliament is determined to make the 2017 budget and the revision of the MFF a success, and we want to do this in 2017. This requires unitary negotiations, and we would expect some kind of outreach from Council, and then a couple of technical corrections which aren't really correctly reflected in the papers. It's very complicated. Line 150477712, preparatory measures, Europe for festivals for Europe. Amendment 529, the payments need to be adapted to 175,000 euros, and then line 09057710, pilot projects, framework for best practice in the fight against the sexual abuse of children on the internet. The line has to be corrected 09047710, and then line 33027719, pilot projects, supervision and support for young people at risk of radicalization within sports projects. So there's amendment 1611, and the line needs to be corrected. 15027719 is now the correct one. Thank you very much.
Grazie, onorevole Geyer.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Geyer. Mr. Tarrant, who's also rapporteur, has equally asked for the floor. Go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. President. I know all sorts of fistfights are more emotional than the dull numbers of a budget, but indeed we need more of the latter than the former. And I know I'm in terrible risk to sound like Sir Humphrey Appleby from the Yes Minister series, but I have to make a technical amendment. And it was written once, including one permanent AD12 post. Now we want to have it including one temporary AD12 post for the director of the Authority for European Political Parties and European Political Foundations. And the Estonian wisdom goes, nothing can be more permanent than a temporary position. I would also like to reach a compromise regarding changes in Parliament's establishment plan to enable members of this chamber to vote really separately on the proposed increases in posts for political groups. And I therefore propose to vote on Amendment 1556 in two parts. First part to be the text as a whole without plus 76 posts, political groups. And second part, only the plus 76 posts. I think if we can do that, Mr. President, we will send a good message to European citizens. Thank you.
Allora abbiamo ascoltato i due.
Thank you very much indeed to the rapporteurs. They have both proposed various technical corrections. Mr. Geyer in particular has suggested 3, and Mr. Tarrant has also presented 1 technical amendment. Mr. Corvin-Mikke.
In the paper, the correction is the budget line is 1502.